Trying to make sure all my setup is in order. I hope everybody is having a wonderful day. Aha, aha, aha. We is set up. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day out there. If you are just coming across my feed for the first time, my name is Sarah and I'm a Witta. Witta is the terminology that I have been using for Indigenous scientists Celtic wise, though my indigeneity is not just to Celtic people, it is pretty global, including to Turtle Island, which is North America. I am an anthropologist and a paleoanthropologist. I've done healing throughout my life. I have degrees in medicine and degrees in anthropology. I have spent most of my life as a storyteller and a healer and a historian. And I use TikTok as a way to kind of teach things. I've spent about 40 years studying the vast majority of this stuff. And when I have done that, I've found that a lot of education is gatekept behind like a $40,000 a year paywall. And because of that, and because of the fact that most language that is used with most academic thought processes is extremely large words that are very hard to understand, even if you have a few degrees, even if you've studied that subject. And so I personally feel that that's inappropriate. And so I use TikTok to try and spread information, to give everybody some information that should be common knowledge that is not common knowledge. So I use this space. We're trying out a couple new things. Today we're trying out getting a bunch of likes to turn the comments on, mainly because a lot of times the comments can be a little bit difficult for everybody to deal with. I have a tendency to get a lot of evolutionists and a lot of alt-right in here and a lot of racists in here who have a tendency to make some horrific statements. And so keeping the comments off can be healthy for everybody involved. I have a lot of people that come in here who get very frustrated with the fact that the comments have a tendency to be crap for a while. And so I have a tendency to turn the comments off. This kind of gives everybody a little bit of control over whether or not the comments are going on. And so we're going to try this. It also allows this information to get out on a broader scale while still keeping the comments off and still keeping this space a little bit safer for everybody involved. When the comments do go on, I will make sure that I double down on this statement when the comments do go on. TikTok gives everybody who gets 1,000 followers a live space. This is my live space. It's my room. It's my house. In my house, in my room, we do not do racism. Race has been debunked. Race does not exist. Racism exists, culture and ethnicity exist, but race does not exist. And I don't deal well with racism. You won't like the way I school you. Everybody else will like the way I school you, but you won't like the way I school you. And I also don't deal well with phobias based on gender and desire. And because I don't deal well with phobias based on gender and desire, you're also not going to like my response to that. Everybody else might like my response to that, but you're not going to like my response to that. So my caveat, my ask is that you don't bring your racism or your phobias based on gender and desire into my space. This is my space. This is my home. I'm inviting you in. I am doing this as an act of love. This is an act of kindness for me. This is me doing my best to ensure that other people understand just how beautiful we are as a species. And in my attempts to ensure that everybody understands just how beautiful we are as a species, and in my attempts to make sure that even in correcting people, I'm doing it with kindness, it is a boundary that when you are coming at me and you are talking to me, that you do it with kindness as well. And that is a boundary. And you get to respect that. We should all be treating everybody else with kindness. That is something that's really innate within us as human beings. It's kind of been indoctrinated out of us. And yet it is something that is very positive and will move us forward as a species. And so because of those things, I ask that if you are commenting, that you're commenting with kindness. I know for a fact that I'm not right in everything. I do know that. Like, nobody is ever right 100% of the time. Anybody who thinks that they are probably isn't that right to start with, right? So there are going to be times that you might have information that I don't have that changes my information. And if you do, please tell me, but tell me what it is. Don't just call me a liar or tell me I'm wrong. Tell me, hey, Witta, it's not correct because this, and this states it's not correct. Or have you read this that states this, that shows that what you're saying is not correct? And then I'm likely to go and take a look. I've got a computer right in front of me. I'm also on YouTube. If you would like to comment and you can't comment because the comments aren't on, I am on YouTube. It's Enwood Ord on YouTube, no dots. And you can go over there and comment. There's a few viewers over there commenting right now. So you can go ahead and do that. And I will pull up sites on my computer to double check shit. If you've got a site that I need to pull up, I'll pull that up and I'll double check shit. But when the comments are on, I ask that if you're telling me something is wrong, don't just tell me something is wrong. Tell me the reasoning that you believe it's wrong, right? Um, with all of that said, we'll go ahead and get a little bit of start going on. I'm trying to do, I teach paleoanthropology on here a lot of the times. And so we talk a lot of the times in here about the species that lived before us. And we talk a lot of times in here about the species that lived alongside us, how we come into being and who we come into being with, and how that interaction happens. Thank you so much. And in that, there's a lot of information. Some of this information, though, doesn't actually get brought up when we're talking about the older species and the species that we lived alongside and the way that we were created and all of those things. And so because of that, I want to make sure and bring some of that information in. When we're talking about who we are as a species and we're talking about how we come to be in as a species, a lot of times we will absolutely see that there are different biological things about us and as a species than we have a tendency to think of about us as a species. We have a tendency to think that we are innately evil or that we're innately fighting this internal struggle against being a good person or being a bad person. And yet, innately, biologically, we see that we're not. We see that there is, and actually, there's only a few people in here, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the comments on. It's a little bit easier for me if there's not a lot of people in here to have the comments on, because then it doesn't have a tendency to be crappy behavior. So I can go ahead and turn them on. So when we are looking at who we are innately and who we are biologically, we see a few things about us innately and biologically, but what we don't see about us innately and biologically is toxicity, right? Most species, in fact, I can't think of a single species that speciates with toxic traits for their species, with traits that stop the continuation of their species. When we look at what is a positive trait for species development and one is a toxic trait for species in development, as well as looking at a purpose behind a species, as well as looking at how species develops, we definitely see that a lot of species in their development develop to fulfill a specific niche within the biome. In fact, I can't think of a single species that doesn't develop to fit a specific niche within the biome, which means that we developed to fit a specific niche within the biome as well. And species don't exist simply to have children. That's not about the thriving of a species for the vast majority. Now, there are species out there that do exist specifically just to create more. Ants, where you have a queen, and the queen just lays eggs all the time, right? And there's constant propagation of species, right? Snakes, where you have a snake that lays a whole bunch of eggs and leaves, right? And so the snakes have no childhood. They wake up out of their eggs and they go off and they become snakes, right? These are species that have this propagation of species, or having babies being the main not the main function, but the main species continuation. The more babies you have, the better your species continuates. We are not one of those species. And we are actually a species that's continuation, that's ability to thrive is not dependent on how many children you have, but on how well those children are nurtured and how well those children are taken care of in the community within. So when we're looking at our traits as humans, as we're looking at what it is that is innate within us, we do not have that biological drive to have 10,000 children. What we have is a biological drive to continue ourself along in a nurturing manner. And the reasons that I say this is because I look at the biology of humanity. I look at what is specific to us. A lot of times in archaeology and anthropology, we call traits that are only within a specific species a basal trait. It's a trait that you only find within that specific species. When we look at sapiens, one of our basal traits is our mental eminence, this bump on our chin. This is a trait that you only find in Homo sapiens. We have not found another species of primate on the planet that has a mental eminence. This is a basal trait within us. Some of the traits that we have specifically as Homo sapiens indicate who we are innately as a species. And one of those traits is the fact that we must have community to have children. And I'm going to go over why. When we look at one of these things that is very specific just to Homo sapiens, one of the things that is very specific just to Homo sapiens is the fact that Homo sapiens are a species that must have midwife assist in childbirth. And the reason for this is the shape of our pelvic outlet versus the shape of the head and shoulders of our children. And I'm going to go ahead and discuss that. When we look at the pelvic outlet, many primates' pelvic outlets are actually this kind of circular shape. And their children, when they come out, are relatively small compared to ours. And so they have small heads. Their shoulders aren't as wide as ours. And so when we're looking at these children coming out, what we're seeing is that children coming through other primates, hello Mia, children coming through other primates, the other primate has a rounder pelvic outlet and the children are smaller. So an infant if large primate is going to have, I don't even know what you think you're talking about. A primate that has a wider pelvic outlet that is rounder, the child coming out being smaller, they're usually faced forward and they can pull them up to their chest, right? Whereas with us, our pelvic outlet is shaped like an oval. And our pelvic outlet being shaped like an oval is also kind of tilted. It's not straight on, it's tilted like this. And when your pelvic outlet is shaped like this, and your head is shaped like this from front to back, but your shoulders are also shaped like this, but they're shaped in the opposite direction, this creates what we call the need for mandatory midwifery. So our babies, when they start out, their nose is facing backwards towards our tailbone. And as we pull them out, we have to turn them a quarter of a turn to get the head that goes like this through the passageway that goes like this, right? And then we have to turn them another quarter turn to get the shoulders that go like this, but in a T from the head out through that. And this is mandatory midwifery. We are the only species currently that has this. The only other species on the planet that's ever had this to our knowledge is Neanderthal. So when we're looking at this, this comes about with the fact that we have very large brains, right? And still needing the ability to not have extremely large pelvises, right? And so because of this mandatory midwifery, what we find is that we have to have community in order to have children. We have to have somebody assist us in birthing our children. Now, of course, we've all heard stories of people throughout history who have had children without assistance. This happens a lot of times if you have somebody who has a larger pelvic outlet or an extremely small child. You know, if your child is under like 5 pounds at birth, it's a little bit easier to come through a larger canal, a larger pelvic outlet, right? So we do see that this can happen. The majority, though, is that this doesn't happen healthily, right? When we're looking at this need for community that comes with this, we also see that we have something, all species have what we call life stages. And these life stages rate from neonate, newborn, to adulthood, fully formed brain closure. Within us, we have 5 life stages. We are the only species ever to have had 5 life stages. Currently, those 5 life stages take us from neonate to adult over a 25-year period. Now, this period has been shortened in the past, right? You know, less time in the past, absolutely. But currently it is 25 years. What this means is that our brain development through that 25-year period is what makes us the intelligent species we are, because we have a longer period of time for brain development in each stage. because you have a period of time from neonate to toddler that is longer than any other period of time from neonate to toddler. The brain has further malleability. It has more growth and is able to grow larger, and able to grow more synapses, more pathways through it. When we're looking at that through this different life stages, neonate to adult, up onto different, areas, toddler to, or neonate to toddler, toddler to child, child to adolescent, adolescent to, teen, and then teen to adult. Right. So when we're looking at these things, what we're looking at is periods of growth for brain development. And in those periods of growth for brain development, it's very important that we have nurture. Without nurture in those periods of growth for brain development, the brain doesn't develop properly. We know this through things like there was a study in the 1950s where they took a bunch of orphan babies, infants, and they put half of them in one room and half of them in another room. And the one in room A, they propped up their bottles, but they never touched them. And the group in room B, they gave them all the attention and all the love that they needed. And this is where we talk about failure to thrive versus thriving. This is a study that proved failure to thrive versus thriving, and proved that we have the need for physical contact as infants and nurture as infants so that we can thrive. Without that, our brain kind of atrophies, our body kind of atrophies, everything kind of goes, ugh, because we don't have the nurture that we need. As a species, we absolutely need nurture. And if we don't have that nurture, we're not thriving. We're not capable, especially as children, of grabbing the brain develop that we really need, grabbing the brain power that we really need. And so when we're looking at that, what we're looking at is the need for us to have nurture within our lives. Now, when we're looking at nurture, a lot of people are like, well, that's the mom's job. And that's a crock of shit. That's everyone's job. It is an entire community's nurturing that can bring a child from neonate to adult, especially when we're talking about a time period where you are not having the ability to go to daycare. You don't have a school. You don't have a house around you, right? When you have to go out and hunt for your food, when you have to go out and collect your water, where you have to keep a fire going, where you have to make all of your tools. During periods of time like this, it's especially important that we have multiple people to nurture a child from infancy to adult, and that we don't have a lot of children, that we might have a child in the community every few years instead of having 5 or 6 children a year. Even today, when we look at raising our child from a neonate to an adult, even if you are a single parent, you still need a community. You have to have a daycare to send your child to while you go to work, or parents or siblings of your own that are helping you care for that child. There's no way that you can provide for the child's care and the monetary value today that you need to provide for the child's care all together at once. Even today, you must have multiple people within your community to get to the point that you have the ability to raise a child from neonate to adult. And all of these people within the community must be nurturing that child. If they're not nurturing that child's brain development isn't as positive, that child is not moving into a positive space, and that child has failure to thrive. So when we're looking at all of these facts, and these are all biological facts, scientific facts. And when we're looking at these things, what we're seeing is that to take a child from infancy, newborn, neonate, to adult, you must have community to nurture that child. And in the need to have community to nurture that child, this represents within us a need for community. Not only do we need to have community to nurture a child, but we have to have community to nurture ourselves. When we look at 40,000 years ago, when we're all living in small bands of people, we're looking at groups of people that are performing several different tasks, but each of the tasks that they are performing are being performed in a space where they need to have multiple people. You're not going to go and get water from the creek without 3 or 4 people, because something at the creek could kill you, right? You got to have your self-defense. You got to make sure that you have people around you to watch your back, right? The same thing when you are out hunting. You're going to need at least 5 to 10 people. More recent studies and understandings have proven what many of us have always known, that women hunt as much as men. And they are proving this through the thought process that actually we don't need to gather. We are omnivoric. We must have plant matter and animal matter within our system to nourish our system. Yet we can get the plant matter from hunting. And the reason that we can get the plant matter from hunting is the fact that animals that we hunt have a tendency to eat plant matter. We don't tend to hunt more predators. We have more of a tendency to hunt herbivores. And when you're hunting herbivores and you kill an herbivore, their stomach contents, rudiment of their stomach is actually one of those things that we have throughout the history of us and prior to the history of us, because history only goes back like 5,000 years. Throughout our time as human beings, we have utilized the rudiment in the stomach, the plant matter within the stomach of a fresh herbivore kill, as the plant matter intake that we take. And so we have shown and proven through recent studies that we absolutely can live, instead of as hunter gatherers, as hunters, and the hunting itself causes the gather as well. So when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is communities of people where you're not getting a gender bias, where you're not getting division of labor based on gender. You're getting division of labor based on what you are good at, what it is that you function your best at. Are you the person that always knows when a predator is nearby? You might be the person that I take with me to go get water, because you're always going to know when a predator is nearby, and you're always going to make sure that I'm safe. Are you a person who always throws a spear? Perfect, always hits right at the point that they're throwing. Then you're the person that I want to take hunting with me. Are you the person that every time you look at a stone, you can see the blade within that stone? Then you're the person that does our flint knapping. These aren't things that happen because somebody else decided them for you. They're things that happen because you decided them for yourself, because they are the things that sing to you. And when things sing to you, when they resonate with you, when they feel right to you, you become good at them. And when we focus our energies on things that we enjoy, we become good at the things that we enjoy. And so when we're looking at who we are prior to historical record, what we're looking at is a people who are not focused so much on I'm doing what somebody else told me to, but are focusing on learning everything that they can until they find the subject that they love. And then they're learning everything they can about that subject. And maybe when they've learned everything they can about that subject, they move on to a new subject because they're a curious human being. That is the other thing that's very innate about us. We are curiosity personified. We love to create new things. We love to come up with new ideas. We love to modify prior inventions. We adapt our adaptations. We are the only species currently that adapts our adaptations. There are many other species on this planet that use tools. Corvids use tools. Monkeys use tools. There are many other species that use tools. There are many other species on this planet who adapt their environment. Beavers adapt their environment with a dam. A fox will adapt its environment with a den. There are many species that adapt their environments. We take our adaptations and we take those adaptations to the next step. Oh, that beaver dam looks really cool, but if I add this to it, or if I twist this, or if I change it this way, it's a better functioning item. We know this from the very start of who we are because we are a species who took the tools that were already in place and adapted them further. And we come from a species who took tools that were already in place and adapted them further. The species prior to us that creates all the subspecies or other species that are the convergence that becomes us is a species who is the first to take somebody else's adaptations and adapt those adaptations. The Oldowan tool complex is our oldest tool complex. This is a Paranthropus boisei tool complex, not even a Homo. Homo means human, and it is the Latin word for human. Not even of a Homo genus, but the Paranthropus genus. Paranthropus boisei creates the Oldowan tool complex, but Homo erectus is the first to adapt the Oldowan tool complex into a new tool complex with the Acheulean tool complex. So we come from a species that adapts their adaptations, and this is one of the gifts that that species gives us. Now, all of this is background for today's topics. Because when we look at today's topics and we look at the things that we have done and the things that are innate to us, are biological to us, are exactly who we are, that really sing to who we are, we look at things that are communal and are nurturing. And when we look at the history of us prior to history, because history itself only goes back about 5,000-6,000 years, history means written story. It is literally everything after we start writing things down. Everything before that is prehistory. When we look at us prehistory, when we look at us before stratification, before city building, before the deification of narcissism, before the deification of hoarding, when we look at us before those things, we look at a species who's extremely communal. We look at a species who needs each other. And we don't see a species that only needs people that look like them. It's very important that we understand that Homo erectus, the species that we come from, has roughly 14, what half of paleoanthropology calls subspecies and half of paleoanthropology calls unique species. But there are roughly 14 species, including our and Homo erectus, so 15 species that live together in what we call bands. Many people look at the word tribe and they think that the word tribe means hunter gatherer. They think that the word tribe means primitive. They think that the word tribe means a specific style of living. The word tribe means community based on genetic lineage. It does not mean how that community interacts with the environment around it. It only means that it is a community based on genetic lineage. The word band means a community based on not genetic lineage, right? So your tribe is going to be, maybe you have a matriarch who has 10 daughters, and her community is her 10 daughters and the husbands that they bring in, and her granddaughters and the husbands they bring in, and her great granddaughters and the husbands that they bring in. So this is a tribe. It is based on a matrilineal descent. Or it could be a community that is based on a patrilineal descent, where you have a man who has 10 sons and his 10 sons each bring in a wife, right? These are tribes. Tribe is based a community based on genetic descent. A band is a community that is not based on genetic descent. So when we're looking at earlier groups of human, what we are looking at is bands. And the reason that we know this now is also the reason that we know that we come about through convergence and Homo erectus comes about through convergence. When we are looking at sites, from Homo erectus sites, what we're looking at is a lot of times the sites will have 4 or 5 different species or subspecies within them. So you might have a Homo erectus in this site and a Homo heidelbergensis in this site and a Homo antecessor in this site and a Homo ergaster in this site. You might have 2 or 3 of each in this site. And then when the cave collapses, you see 7 or 8 different species of humans all within this singular site. So we're knowing that they are all living together, okay? When we're looking at the way that Homo sapien comes about, the current knowledge of how Homo sapien comes about is that starting at roughly 300,000 years ago in North Africa, in Morocco, we see that our first Homo sapien comes about, exists. This is a find that we found in the 70s, but we recently redated it. We thought it was 40,000 years ago. We now know it's 300,000 years ago. When we're looking across Africa, we are seeing that we see people coming about, Homo sapiens coming about from 300,000 years ago on. What we're seeing is that as they're coming about in these early spaces, they're coming about through what we have thought up until now was a theoretical speciation through convergence. There are about 5 theories of speciation, and 4 of them we've thought all happened. But the 5th one, convergence, is something that we have thought until this year was theoretical. We thought it could happen, but we hadn't seen any examples of it happen. And then this year we went, oh shit, we're an example. So when we're looking at it, what we're looking at is bands of ergaster, heidelbergensis, antecessor, all living together. And in those bands, a child is born that looks like a Homo sapien. And in a band over here, a child is born that looks like a Homo sapien. And in a band over here, a child is born that looks like a Homo sapien. And when you get several different bands with a lot of different Homo sapien children being born into these bands, you end up with different communities of Homo sapiens within these different bands. And so you have a band that is now antecessor, heidelbergensis, gaster, and sapien. Now you start out with 3 or 4, 2 or 3. Good morning. 2 or 3, 3 or 4 of these different, hello everybody, bands that include groups of Homo sapien within them. And then roughly 135,000 years ago to 125,000 years ago, we see that this converges into one species. And this species becomes the Homo sapien species that we know today. It is not Homo sapiens sapien yet. That doesn't come about until about 40 to 50,000 years ago. And that is a change in our brain development that makes us Homo sapiens sapien, which means human, wise, wise. Sapien means wise. And we get the word sapien for us because of our mental eminence, because we're the only species that has this mental eminence. And we've decided, of course, that we're the best species on the planet, our own egos, right? So when we look at this, what we're seeing is that Homo sapiens sapien is after Homo sapien. And Homo sapien as a species convergence and a whole species starts roughly 135,000 years ago, though the earliest of us are 300,000 years ago. What this tells us is that we lived in groups of people that didn't look like us. Our mothers, our grandmothers, our fathers, our grandfathers, our aunts and our uncles, they didn't look like us. And so we didn't have a thought process that you don't look like me, so therefore there must be something wrong with you, right? We didn't have that thought process of othering because we were all human. We were all other beings, right? And if my mother has mid-face prognosis and she's like this out here and her chin's way back here, but she's got heavy brow ridges and her forehead's receding, I still see her as my mother. She nursed me. If my father has lower face prognosis and it sticks out like this, but his chin recedes and he's got heavy brow ridges, he's still my father. He still taught me how to hunt. He's probably still taught me how to gather water, right? So when we're looking at these things, we're not looking at people that are different than us. We're looking at people. So when we start to move out of the African area, and by this I mean Africa at the time of our development, this Arabian Peninsula is actually a part of Africa. It is not separated by that sea in this area. It's not got separated by the marshes or the Red Sea. It is absolutely a part of Africa because of the fact of mass glaciation of the polar caps causing water levels to lower. So we see that we start ending up in the Levant area, in the Arabian Peninsula area at about 150,000 years ago. So again, if we converge as a species at 135,000 years ago to 125,000 years ago, this is slightly before our convergence as a species. And when we're looking at this convergence of a species happening after we're moving out of this area, we're moving out into this area, the Levant area, the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, or the Arabian Peninsula area. We're moving into this area into a space that has Neanderthal. Now, Neanderthal were never in Africa. They were in Europe because of the way that they speciated, because of who they were. Africa was not a healthy space for them. So we're moving up and we're meeting an entirely new species. It doesn't look, or it might look a little bit like, because it is descended from some of the same, but it isn't the species that we grew up with. It isn't grandma, right? It's an entirely new species. And what do we do when we see that? We love it. We live with it. We are in two caves, a 5-minute walk from each other for 100,000 years. And in that time frame, we both come up with these fantastic ideas. We both start this development of our brain that leads to where we are today. It is after this time period of both of us being together that we come up with a hashtag, both of us. We see that the first hashtag is on a wall in a cave done by Homo naledi at 335,000 years ago. But we see that the first hashtag within Homo sapien and the first hashtag within Homo neanderthalis comes after 90,000 years ago. This is after we have met up, after we have come together, after we have learned from each other and are starting to move forward with each other's understandings. When you see two boxes meet, there's an explosion of thought. If I live inside a box, I only think inside this box. It's the only box I know. I've never had any other ideas. But when I see another box, now I have new ideas. So nobody outside of Africa currently, or whose family has been outside of Africa currently for several generations, is going to show African DNA unless they have a recent African ancestor. So I have African DNA, but that's because I have a slave grandmother, right? Sudanese, 1750 something is when she escaped, got records of it and everything else, right? So I have African DNA from that. And actually in my DNA, I don't see it. I see it in my aunt's DNA, but Ancestry and 23andMe don't do a full genome. So they only do like 1 to 25%. So the African DNA in me is probably in the rest of that genome. And when I get a full genome done, it will see, right? But that is why I would personally have African DNA, or my aunt would have African DNA. Somebody who does not have an ancestor within the last 10 to 12 generations who is from Africa is not going to have African DNA. Most of the DNA that you see is from ancestors very recently. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't match us. Like my DNA matches to Kennewick Man, right? And Kennewick Man is 12,000 years old, right? So like, okay, maybe it's 15,000. He's 15,000 years old, right? So my DNA matches to that. So we can see that you can match DNA further back Yet you can't, like, it's not going to say Kennewick man is my relative on a standard DNA test or an ancestry DNA test. You have to go into the ones that match you to graves, things like that. Um, Out of Africa theory stated that we all left Africa, everybody outside of Africa left Africa at 150,000 years ago and started evolving further. This is where they talk about out of Africa theory has been debunked. Out of Africa theory has been debunked. It was a very racist thought process that stated that everybody within Africa had not evolved and everybody outside of Africa had evolved and everybody outside of Africa had left 150,000 years ago. We know now that that's bullshit. Uh, we are from Africa, right? And so out of Africa still does exist, right? It's just we want to make sure that we're qualifying that it's not out of Africa theory, because out of Africa theory is racism. But knowing that we all come from Africa initially is correct. So our species does all start in Africa, and our species then expands out of Africa. We see that the last or that the migration of the vast majority of people outside of Africa is at about 50,000 years ago. Though they're pushing that back to about 52,000 years ago right now. They have found people in France at 52,000 years ago, and the DNA shows that Turtle Island indigenous people are 52,000 years here. We don't have finds that show 52,000 years here yet. What we do have is finds that show 33 to 35,000 years ago here. And that's like actual tools or something in the archaeological record, right? But when we look at the fact that indigenous Australians have been in Australia for 70,000 years, we're looking at that through the DNA. And what we're looking at with that is the fact that as they map the DNA, they can map the generations in the DNA. And when they map the DNA and the generations within the DNA, and that mapping of the generations within the DNA, what they're doing is they're deciding a timeline from the time or back to when that split in the DNA happens, right? When that split of, so mitochondrial DNA, everybody in Africa has L mitochondrial DNA. Starting moving outside of Africa into like the Levant area and stuff like that, you start to see M, then you see N, then you see O, and things like that. So the split for Turtle Island indigenous people seems to be at 52,000 years ago, and that's where we see the split into C1 mitochondrial DNA. Thank you so much. And when we see the split for, and I think it's Q in Australia, but I can't remember if Q is a Y DNA that's here. And I'm bad with DNA. It's not my forte. But we do see, or they do state that with the DNA with indigenous people in Australia, they see that split at 70,000 years ago. So indigenous Australians have been there for 70,000 years is what they're stating. So when we're looking at those things, what we're looking at is that we're moving out of the Levant area at roughly 52,000 years ago for everybody except for indigenous Australians who are already in Australia by this point of time. And when we're seeing that, we're seeing this movement across first. It seems that this movement across and down and through the islands of the South Pacific into Turtle Island and Abayala comes really early on, just almost like a direct passageway over. Though we do see that there's roughly 10,000 years in that direct passage, because during that time we get Denisovan DNA within us, and Turtle Island indigenous people and Abayalian indigenous people have 0.02 or 0.03% Denisovan DNA, and that's something that took about 10,000 years to get. So, or that's at least how they're rating that by that knowledge, by their knowledge of how that DNA is coming in, and blah 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 blah. When we're looking at that, unless you have a recent ancestor from Africa, it's not going to show that you have African DNA. It does not mean that we didn't start in Africa. It just means that your ancestors are no longer African. They've been outside in their space for a long period of time. And so it's not going to trace back like that. Hello. Which DNA test would be best to find lost relatives? So for me, I was looking for my biological father. I didn't know my biological father. I used Ancestry because it is a broad database of DNA within the United States. And so I figured I would be able to find him through that. So if you're looking for a relative, 23andMe and Ancestry are pretty good ones for that. If you're looking for finding your genealogy, if you're looking for finding your ancestors, you probably want a whole genome. And the whole genome is going to be something that's going to cost a little bit more. On my website, I have a tab on my website that says DNA tools or something like that, DNA. And underneath it, there's a few different sites. There's a place to get a whole genomic test. But if you are looking for relatives, personally would go for 23andMe and Ancestry. It's not going to give you as much information, but it is more likely to be able to connect you. Um, Yeah, and it's not that bright of a database. The more you use it, the more it becomes accurate. Not only is it not that bright of a database, it compares you to modern day people in modern day regions. So, like, you could have African ancestors, you can be from like South Africa, but all of the people that carry your mitochondrial DNA have been moved up to, say, Holland because of the Dutch colonizing South Africa. And so, your DNA might state that you're from Holland, like that your closest relation is in Holland, even though you're black as fuck and from South Africa, right? Just because of the fact that there is that the way that Ancestry and 23andMe do their comparison DNA is to modern populations, not to prior to colonization populations. The same problem exists within 23andMe and Ancestry with trying to find indigenous relatives. There's not a lot of indigenous people in Turtle Island and Abiyala who are uploading their DNA to those sites for a lot of real good reasons, because the government can be fucked up. So can religion, and some of them are run by religion. And those both have a really huge history of really harming indigenous people. So many indigenous people in Turtle Island aren't comfortable giving their DNA there, which is totally understandable, right? So when we did not kill off any other species, we enveloped them. We didn't kill them off. There's no evidence whatsoever that we killed off any other species. The only evidence that we have is that we bred with them. It's literally the only evidence that we have, is that we came across with them and we mated with them. Nothing shows that we injured any of them physically. Nothing shows that we killed them off. Nothing shows that we outcompeted them. So when we're looking at trying to use those sites to relate, just keep those things in mind. It's absolutely good tools when it comes to finding relatives. And if you're looking for a cheap way to kind of get some information, it's a good tool as well because it's cheap, right? A full genomic test costs like $300 at its lowest end. And Ancestry can cost you $60. There's a sale online or sale on right now for $59 for Ancestry tests. So it can be very cheap comparatively, and it can get you started. And then you can take those tests and you can go to sites like GEDmatch, or you can go, that's not true, flops. I would like you to tell me where aggression helps species progression, especially aggression towards other human beings helps species progression. Can you tell me where aggression is positive for species progression? That would be my question to what you're saying. No, it doesn't speed up progress. By your thought process, then we've been aggressive for 300,000 years, but we've only been progressing for 5,000 years by your thought process. So, were we aggressive for 395,000 or 295,000 years and had no progress, but in 5,000 years, we've gotten a lot of progress from aggression? And evil is not indicative of having intelligence. I'm not your love, but thank you. I'm glad that you have a loving nature. You can be evil with an intelligence. There's plenty of human beings who lack intelligence who have been extremely evil. Hitler was not an intelligent person. Hitler was not an intelligent person. In fact, he flunked out and failed out of everything except for oration. The only thing Hitler was good at was oration. He was not an intelligent being. So that's a prime example that evil is not intelligent, right? That it does not equate intelligence. Just stating. And your idea that evil equates intelligence is one of those things that you're being taught to make it okay for people to be evil. Make it okay for people to be shitty, so that you're indoctrinated into the idea that it is okay for other people to be shitty to you. It must mean that they're intelligent. So therefore I should give them a pass because they're smart. Hitler. I just named something that is evil or bad and is stupid. Hitler was functionally stupid. Hitler was not an intelligent man. If you have done any study into Hitler, who Hitler was as a human being, he flunked out of school. He could not do any schoolwork. Like, he was completely incapable of schoolwork. He tried to go and be an artist, couldn't do that. He tried to go and be an architecture, could not do that. He avoided being enlisted into the army. When he finally got caught and had to enlist in the army, he then ended up being very low ranking. He was sent as a spy on a specific group, and instead of spying on that specific group, he instead took that group over. And the way he took that group over was through orientation, speaking about hate by being Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a megalomaniac, and Donald Trump is probably one of the most evil people that's lived. Like, Donald Trump has evil within him, right? And yet Donald Trump is not a smart person, not a smart person at all. So I would state that our most evil humans in history don't show a modicum of intelligence. So evil and intelligence do not equate. Hey, hey. How do I identify smart or define intelligence? Curiosity, understanding that you don't know everything, and constantly seeking more information. And utilizing that information for the benefit of myself or others. Personally, I believe that to be truly intelligent, you utilize that information for the benefit of others. No, not gullible. How is that gullible? If I am studying every aspect of something to learn all I can about it, does that mean I'm gullible? That would, in fact, mean that I'm inquisitive. Gullible, is believing what other people tell you without looking it up on your own. That's gullibility, right? You think I was able to be taken advantage of by somebody smarter, but that's not true. You don't know me to make that judgment call, A. B, not a lot of people take advantage of me. People have in the past. I would say that the people who have in the past were not smarter than me. They were just better at lying and manipulating than I was, because I don't lie well. I'm a shit liar. Thank you. Thank you. If someone keeps pointing out my gullibility, am I upset with them or is it my fault? First of all, if someone points out my gullibility, but they don't know what they're talking about, I'm not upset with them. I think that they have issues, right? I don't care that they're blaming me or that they're thinking I'm gullible. They have issues. They don't have an understanding of humanity if they think that I'm gullible. So if they keep pointing out to me that I'm gullible, I'm thinking that they're idiotic. I'm not thinking that I'm angry at them. I'm thinking that they need to get a better brain, right? And I don't accept it being my fault when it's not something that I'm doing. It's your fault for assuming, because assuming makes an ass out of you and me, but only in your eyes, because your assumptions don't affect me unless you're harming me based on them, right? So when we are looking at who we are prior, when we are looking at who we are prior, we absolutely see that we need nurture and we need community and we are creative. These are things that are innately a part of us. Things that are not innately a part of us are going to be things that are toxic to our species development. Species development is about thriving as a species. It's not about, can you make a phone, right? It's not about, can you make better tools or what you perceive to be better tools. What species development is about thriving as a species. It's about having safety and security. It's about having continuation that is safe and secure, right? And when we look at species development and thriving as a species, what we see is that the things that are innate within us help us do that. The things that are not innate within us, the things that are toxic to us, are things that have come about in later dates. They're things that have been brought into us or indoctrinated into us, because no species actually develops with toxic traits to their species continuation. Now, mutations happen, and mutations happening can absolutely create a situation where toxic traits come into a species, right? Yet, those are, again, mutations. They're not a positive part of species development. They're not a part of what makes a species. They're a part of what breaks a species. So if something is toxic to a species, it is something that lessens that species viability, lessens that species survivability. And something that is positive is something that is going to be innate within them that helps species viability, right? Now, as a species, we never thought that we needed to propagate enough to complete the whole fucking planet. That was not our point. We never thought that until we got religion. Religion brought us into this idea that we own the planet, that it was a gift, and our job was to create as many fucking humans as we could to just cover this planet and obliterate it. Because as a gift, we should destroy it, right? When we look at who we are prior to that, we don't see these toxic traits. We see that these toxic traits start out roughly, I'm going to say roughly 10,000 years ago. And the reason that I say roughly 10,000 years ago is we don't get documentation of these toxic traits until 5,000 years ago, but we don't see these toxic traits in the archaeological record before 10,000 years ago. So I can't point to the first narcissistic god king until 5,000 years ago. I can point out the first narcissistic god king, and I can point out the start of stratification. I can point out the start of stratification at 10,000 years ago and the rise of violence within our species, because we were not violent before 10,000 years ago. I can point out to you those things, and I can point out those documentations, but I can't show you that because there wasn't written word at this time. I can't name a specific king who displayed toxic traits or show the symptoms of narcissism that specific kings were dealing with until after we start writing this down. But all of our early writings of our early god kings show narcissists. They're very much symptomatic of narcissists. Like, the documentation shows a narcissistic inducing childhood and shows a narcissistic god king, right? And so I can point out where the narcissism rise starts specifically. Yet I believe that that narcissism rise is going to start prior to that, because that narcissism rise is going to start with that stratification of society. So when we look at that, this is the first thing that we're really talking about today. What we're talking about is the fact that we have 2,000 skeletons prior to 10,000 years ago, right? 2,000 individuals that we have some skeletons of. No, Neanderthals and Denisovan didn't fight with us at all. And I'll go over that. We're doing that right now. So in the 2,000 skeletons that we have prior to 10,000 years ago, none of them show definitive violence. We have 2% that show, or roughly 2%, that show something that could possibly be violence. Now, what this means is if I have a skull that has been hit by a rock, this doesn't mean that a human welded the rock to hit the skull. Now, it could be that a human welded a rock and hit the person in the skull, or it could be the cave collapse hit the person in the skull, right? It could be that they were out walking and they're in a cut, right, in the ground, where they're walking through a cut that's created a shallow valley, and somebody is standing up top and kicks a rock off by accident, and the rock hits them in the skull. There's several different ways that this crush of the skull could have happened. It's not definitively violence, and unless something is definitively violent, we don't get to decide that it's violent just because of our interpretation of it, right? So when we're looking at this, what we see again is prior to 10,000 years ago, and all of the skeletons that we have prior to 10,000 years ago, and all of the humans, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthal, Homo denisovan, Homo sapien, all of the humans that we have prior to 10,000 years ago, none of them show definitive violence. Roughly 2% of them show something that could be attributed to violence, but is not definitive violence. At 10,000 years ago, we see definitive violence enter the archaeological record. And when we see definitive violence enter the archaeological record, evidence of things that could possibly be violent or are definitive violence leaps to 15 to 20%. Okay. So prior to 10,000 years ago, there's no definitive violence in the archaeological record. And any form of anything that could possibly be attributed to violence is under 2%. At 10,000 years ago, things become definitively violent and it leaps to 15 to 20%. So for 290,000 years, we were a non-violent species. At 10,000 years ago, we became a violent species. What happened? What causes that shift? That's what we're talking about today. So what happens at 10,000 years ago? I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist, so I do know and you do not, unless you're an archaeologist and an anthropologist and have been studying it. I'm trying to give you that information. You can shut your mouth and listen. Your choice, or scroll on. So what we see, no, I don't actually, this isn't a discussion chat. And my website in my profile, nwitaor.com, compiles sources. It's like a bibliography, and I have sources for all of this information on that, because trying to drop them in here, it doesn't let us actually, it won't let me drop it, and it won't let you click on it if I can get it dropped, right? So it's all on my website. The website is in my profile. It is nwitaor.com. Again, this is my personal website, and it compiles sources. Also, I always want to state that the sources compiled on this are from very many different sources. They're all reputable sources, right? Like, like, I'm not a major media person, but if CNN says it, then it's a reputable source, because we know that CNN is a decent. I mean, it's not something I would use for further information, right? And what it is I'm trying to give you sources that you can look at, that you can see, that you can actually read, because many of the sources from journal articles and stuff like that are kept behind a paywall. And so if I give you this, then there's a bibliography at the bottom of all of these articles, so you can click on that and go into further information and find that information in a way that you can actually access, because otherwise I'm going to give you shit that I can reach, but you can't, because I have credentials that allow me to reach it, right? So this is a Gravachian person from about 27,000 years ago. And at this point, we're all dark of skin. Light skin doesn't come about until much later. In fact, even Otzi seems to have been darker of skin. We don't see light of skin really coming about into a population majority until roughly 4,000 years ago. And so pretty much everybody prior to then is going to be on the darker scale. Darker scale, not everybody's dark, just darker scale. So at 10,000 years ago, what we see is this shift. And the shift that we're saying, don't hassle. Did you hear the rest of what I stated, or did you take one sentence? Because I specifically stated that I'm not sure. I mean, it's considered reputable, but it gives you sources so that you can dig in deeper. And it's something that you can access that's not behind a paywall. I am not here to give you every little bit of information that I possibly can. I am here to teach you how to learn, to show you that there is information out there, and for you to learn how to dig deeper. It's not my responsibility to spoon feed you. It's not my responsibility, or anybody's responsibility, to spoon feed you. Right? So when we're looking at 10,000 years ago, what we're seeing is that roughly 10,000 years ago, we see this shift in understanding. About 18,000 to 15,000 years ago, we see the start of monoculture along the Nile. Now, the Nile has been a part of who we are as humans for 3 million years. Paranthropus boisei lives there. Homo habilis lives there. Homo erectus lives there. The Nile is a space that is really the cradle of humanity, is really along the Nile. Everybody wants to state that it's over in the fucking, it's not. It's along the Nile. The Nile is a space that is extremely fertile, that we have been living since way before we were we, okay? When we're looking at the Nile and we're looking at the cradle of humanity within the Nile space, what we're looking at is that the Nile is like this because of the flooding every year. The flooding every year. I didn't mute anybody, baby. One of my moderators did, because somebody was being an ass. And it has nothing to do with like. It has everything to do with your behavior. There are people that have come in since I stated this. So let me go ahead and state it again. And I did turn off the comments afterwards. So let me go ahead and state this again. This is my space. This is my house. This is my room. Everybody who gets 1,000 followers gets a room on TikTok. TikTok will give you this space. If you're able to get 1,000 followers. In my space, I have boundaries set. And in my space and in my set boundaries, you either listen to my set boundaries and you follow my set boundaries, you get the fuck out or you get muted. Period. That's healthy. Okay. And in my space and in my set boundaries, don't just tell me I'm wrong. Tell me why you think I'm wrong. I am bringing you information that I have curated, that I have worked on. This is 40 years of fucking knowledge that I am bringing to you for free because I don't believe in paywalls, because I don't believe education should be gatekept. So I'm bringing it to you for free, teaching you how to find more information on your own as well. Okay. I don't deal with people just telling me I'm a liar or telling me I'm wrong. You have to come at me with knowledge. If you're just coming at me, I'll come at you back. I've stood 3 front lines and have been in 3 war zones. I'm not the bitch to fuck with. Okay. That's number 1. Number 2, I don't deal with racism in this space. In this space, if you're going to be racist, you're not going to like my response. Everybody else will, but you will not. And in this space, I don't deal with phobias based on gender and desire. If you're going to be phobic, get the fuck out or you won't like my response. Period. If you are in my space and you're acting an ass and one of my moderators mutes you, or I turn off the comments because there's way too many of you guys acting like an ass, that's on you, not on me. But this is my space. I get to set boundaries. I get to set the rules because it's my space and you come in correct or you don't come at all. Have a fun day. Scroll the fuck on. Now, we haven't talked about the younger dryads because that's not what we're discussing. And I didn't say no white people. God, you're fun. Anyways, so roughly 10,000 years ago, we see that this thought process that has developed along the Nile of mono-agriculture, of planting in rows in a space that we're tending minutely, right? Before this, what we're seeing with an animistic thought process pre-global, right? Animistic thought process being pretty global, what we're seeing is tending of the land. This is our niche. This is why we developed within the biome, is to tend the land, right? So in tending the land, we don't remove things from their space. We don't control things. We just work with them, right? So when we're working with them and when we're tending the land, it's an entirely different thing. We're not removing all of the nutrients from the area. When you are removing all the nutrients from the area and then you're planting a monoculture or monocrop, you have to be doing this in an area that replaces fertility every year. So when they're doing this along the Nile, this is a space that is replacing fertility every year. And since it's replacing fertility every year, these crops grow well. Okay. And this works well. This starts roughly 18 to 15,000 years ago along the Nile. And then we see that the husbandry of wheat and the husbandry of barley starts in a couple other places. We see that in what we call the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia area, that we see some starting of subsistent farming there, some husbandry of animals and some husbandry of wheat and barley there. And then we see the same thing in West Africa. When we see these things starting, what we're seeing is these things are being taken from the Nile where they work and they're being put in different areas. We see that roughly, I think that our earliest subsistent farming starting in the Mesopotamia area is like 13,000 years ago. In this time, what we're seeing is maybe a little community that's got a couple of subsistence farms or a couple of monoculture farms. More likely, we're seeing a single person farming. And what we're seeing is that when they're doing this, they're not really, it doesn't really work very well. They're not doing it in an area that it's really fertile. So what you're doing is you're going in and you're stripping all of the fertility, all of the nutrients out of the area and replacing it with a single crop. And when you're doing that, what you're seeing is that that single crop isn't getting nutrients. It isn't getting fertilized by all of the different things in the area. Whereas that crop, if it had remained in its space, would get fertilized by all the different things in the area. Oftentimes, I like to compare the growth of corn, the husbandry of corn in Turtle Island and Abya, Turtle Island being North America, Abya being South America, to the husbandry of wheat. Now, corn and wheat both start out as something that's the same size of a grain. They're both grains, and they both start out in the same size grain. Not the same grain, but the same size of grain. You see within Abya and Turtle Island that there is this husbandry or tending of corn within the space that it's in, and this understanding that it needs other things within its biome. This is where we get the three sisters in certain areas, right? And what we're seeing is that corn remains in the space that it's supposed to be in, the space that it starts, instead of being removed from that space and put somewhere else to be guided into growth. But in this space that it starts, it's guided into growth. And this is how we get corn from something as small as the start of wheat was into the big ear of corn it is today. Whereas when you go to places within and places within monoculture or Western agriculture, you see that instead of nurturing those things within the biome, tending those things within the biome, they pulled them out of the biome, removed the biome, and planted them. So they nurture them into something that doesn't get very big when you look at the comparison, right? Because they're not nurturing it as something that has a lot of nutrient from the extension of the biome. That extended biome nutrients us all. The extended biome gives to all of us, right? Not just the plants and the space, but also the animals in the space. And all of those things interacting creates nutrients in the soil, creates nutrients around. All of these things interacting gives growth, right? So when you're removing it from a nutrient-rich area and you're putting it into a space where you've denuded it of all the nutrients, what you end up doing is creating a space where it's hard for it to grow. It doesn't have everything it needs. Now, when you're doing this along the Nile, you're doing this in a space that gets refertilized every area because of the seasonal flooding, or every year because of the seasonal flooding. But when you're doing it in a space that doesn't have the seasonal flooding along the Nile, you aren't getting what you're getting out of the seasonal flooding along the Nile. So when we see that subsistence farming, monoculture crop farming starts in Ur, Mesopotamia, what we're seeing is that these farms are not able to subsist for multiple groups of people or even for the small families that they're trying to subsist for. You might see a few small communities based on this, but you're not seeing larger communities based on this. We see our first agricultural based city at 10,000 years ago. The city is called Angazal. And I can't remember the name of the river it's on, but it is in a river valley that's extremely fertile. Thank you, everybody, for all this stuff. It's in a river valley that's extremely fertile. And when it's in this river valley that's extremely fertile, it plants, it removes everything from the valley, it plants, it takes their animals and puts them up in the hills and herds around. In 300 years, it strips this area and causes climate destruction, and this area is no longer livable. It went from a fertile valley to totally destroyed desert in 300 years, right? Anyways, so when we see that, what we're seeing is the start of stratification and the start of city building, what we consider civilization. It is not very civilized, though. It's just what we call civilization. So when we're seeing, and again, I don't remember the name of the river. I'd have to open a book. And I'm not sure where that specific book is currently. Egypt. I have pulled it out and we were talking about it before and I put it somewhere else and now I don't know where that specific book is. So I cannot give you the name of the river valley. I do know that this is near Ur. This is in Mesopotamia. Now, when we see this, and that the city's name is Ain, A-I-N, Ghazal, G-H-A-Z-A-L. So you can look at that up and it will give you what river it was along. Now, when we look at that, what we're seeing is that this first city that is created and built for stratification and for agriculture really just causes climate destruction. It causes destruction in the area and it creates a space that has to be left because they've ripped all the fertility from it. And I'm telling you, you just have to listen for just a minute, okay? So when we're looking at this, we're looking at the start of stratification. We're looking at a person who has decided to gather up all of the different farmers in the area, bring them together into a city under one rule, okay? And in bringing them together in a city under one rule, we're seeing the start of hierarchy. We're seeing somebody in charge, people below them, people below them, people below them, right? And so when we're looking at this start of stratification, and we're looking at this start of this thought process that one person gets to lead everybody else, what we're looking at is at the same time, violence starts rising around the world. Now, when we start seeing the documentation of this, we're looking at 5,000 years later. Now, some of these things are stories that are older, right? Just like the sagas are documenting stories 1,000 years prior, right? We're looking at oral traditions being put into writing. So some of them translate to how things start. And when we're looking at how these things are starting, what we're looking at is narcissism. You're looking at a person who was abandoned as an infant, Sargon, uh, Hammurabi. Very many of these early kings have the same story. Sargon himself was abandoned as an infant, put in a basket, floated down the river, was taken out by a farmer, was raised alone by that lonely farmer in a very hard scrabble existence, and came to the belief that one of his parents was a god, right? And since one of his parents was a god, he didn't deserve this hard scrabble subsistence. So Sargon gathers up a few of his buddies, all of them bullies, and he starts bullying the people around until he can get to the point of city creation. So when you're looking at the stories that come of who these god kings were in the initial, what you're looking at is stories that are really along the lines of a narcissistic child, not a narcissistic childhood, it's childhood that creates narcissism, and adults who display narcissism traits, right? So when we're looking at that, what we're looking at is this start and this rise of narcissistic behavior within the society. And we're looking at narcissistic behavior being put at the highest level, right? So this becomes your king. Now, your king is in charge of everything. And your king is having you give them food so that they can feed their soldiers. This is also where we see the rise of othering. And how we see the rise of othering is the idea that the barbarians in the hills are coming to steal your food. So you have to pay me in that food so that I can feed my army, so my army can protect you so the barbarians don't steal your food. I've already stole it anyways, right? So when we see this, it's not false information. Everything I'm stating is correct. I didn't say MPD. Nowhere am I saying MPD. Do you see MPD? I said narcissism. So maybe you should listen, right? So I have put myself at the top of this hierarchy. I have all of these people underneath me who are going to keep you in control. So you're going to pay me. Now I need you to pay me so that I can pay them so they can keep you in control. How do I do that? I want you to not look at me as evil. I need you to look at somebody else as evil. So I start telling you that it's the barbarians in the hills. Now this translates down, and we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. Okay. Well, what we do see is that all evidence points to, and I will say at this point, MPD. So all evidence in our early stories points to these god kings having narcissism. Now, when we're looking at this and we're looking at the childhood that would induce narcissism, the belief that they are a god, which is pretty spot on for narcissism, and the behavior that comes after, being somebody who can get everybody to listen to them, being charismatic, putting everybody in control underneath you, you have to do things for me. These are all things that if you've ever dealt with a narcissist, you know happen, okay? If you've read anything about narcissism, you know happen. So when we're looking at this, we're seeing the first start of narcissism within our people, the first start of these traits within our people. Now, do they have the genetics for narcissism at that time? Who the fuck knows, right? We're not DNA testing these people. We don't fucking know. We now know that narcissism is two things: having the genetic for narcissism, the genetic trait for narcissism, and having a trauma that flips the switch for that trait. Now, you can become narcissistic without having that genetic trait. If you have that genetic trait, though, you need to have that trauma to create the narcissism. You don't just become narcissist because you have that genetic trait. When we're looking at this, what we're looking at is you have a society now where to actually thrive for your children, to actually maintain stability for your children, you have to marry up, right? You have to marry the higher levels of the stratified society so that you can maintain your children's being able to be okay, right? And so this is, to my mind, and again, I'm not a sociologist, I am not a psychiatrist, I'm an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a historian, and a healer who has degrees in medicine and archaeology, okay? To my mind, when I am looking at all of these things, you can see where all of us trying to marry kings who have the traits for narcissism, who have the traits for NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, are getting those traits in our children as we're marrying into safety, right? And this, in my mind, is why we now have such a high percentage of narcissistic personality disorder within our people, okay? This starts, though, at 10,000 years. And at the same time that we see this start of stratification, we see this start of city building, we see a rise in violence. Again, prior to 10,000 years ago, we see 2,000 skeletons with under 2% of things that could possibly be attributed to violence. They are not definitive violence. They could possibly be violence. After 10,000 years ago, we see 15 to 20%, and we're looking at definitive violence. One of the first forms of definitive violence that we have is roughly 10,000 years ago in Kenya, where there is a massacre of 8 people. And in this massacre of 8 people, we see a pregnant woman who is in a cross-leg sitting position, like crisscross applesauce, right? With her hands bound underneath her belly in this position, who has her head stove in. This is representation of definitive violence in the archaeological record, right? So when we see this start of definitive violence in the archaeological record, and we see the evidence of violence spike from under 2% maybe to 15 to 20% positive, we are looking at this rise of hierarchy at the same time. When we're looking at this rise of hierarchy, we start to see the deification of narcissistic behavior. Okay. We start to see that our gods act like narcissists. We start to see that this maintaining of control, I'm special, and therefore I should control you, and you should laud me and worship me. It doesn't matter what I do to you, starts to rise. Okay. So when we see this, what we're seeing is this deification of narcissism that I'm talking about. We see that this comes along with violence, and this comes along with stratification, and it comes along with monocrop agriculture. All of these things are really intertwining to create this entirely new way of being. This is an experiment. It's an experiment that's gone really fucking wrong, but it is an experiment. So when we're seeing this, we're seeing that to maintain control, they have to manufacture something for you to be afraid of instead of them. And this is where we see the manufacturing of othering, the start of othering, and the manufacturing of the idea of evil. So when we're looking at othering, what we're looking at is, again, I want to maintain control over you. And to maintain control over you, I need you to hate somebody besides me. I need you to be afraid of somebody besides me. So we see that narcissism starts, or not narcissism, othering starts with the barbarian in the hills. You need to pay me your grain so that I can pay my army the grain so that my army can protect you from the barbarians in the hills. You lost your grain either way, but at least the barbarians didn't steal it. After othering based on the barbarians in the hills versus us in the cities, when we get to a point where we have many different people living in cities, we see othering transfer into nationalism. My city is better than your city. Our city is better than their city. Their city is going to come and take from our city because their city doesn't have all the things our city does. Our city is superior and they want our superiority. After we see nationalism become the method of othering, we start to see religion. Well, actually, and I always have to go back with this one. Actually, we see gender becoming the start becoming an othering. So after nationalism, we start to see this rise of othering within your nation. We have to have a way to other within the nation so that he can maintain control over all of us, right? And so he's telling us that there's somebody else in here that's the problem. We see this with the ancient Greeks where they start othering females. where we start to see women becoming weaker, which we are not physically weaker. And we start to see women becoming the problem, which we are not the problem. And we start to see men in charge. Okay. So when we start to see men in charge and women are weak and men have the brain power and women don't have the brain power, this is othering within your society, not between societies, but within your specific society. Okay. So when you start to see this othering within your specific society, it is currently being recorded on YouTube as we speak. And so it will go up as soon as I turn it all off. When we're looking at this start of othering within society, we see this um, start of othering becoming othering of gender. We don't only have two genders at this point of time. Even the Greeks don't only have genders. Most societies don't have two genders. Two genders is a very recent thing. We don't even biologically only have two sexes. We biologically have three sexes: male, female, and intersex. So this idea that women are the problem comes about from this thought process of the ancient Greeks. We see this specifically in Athens, and we see this specifically because they preferred teenage or preteen boys for their sexual partners. They were very pedophilic. And because Athens preferred preteen boys to women as their sexual partners, it was very much capable of them to make women less on the scale. They didn't like women, they were just there to provide more children, right? So we see this start within there. This does not mean that they're the only place that did this. This is just the earliest documentation that I can find. When we look at Egypt at the same time, Egypt has 17 queens in their own right on their roll of kings. Okay. When we look at other spaces at the same time, we see that within other spaces at the same time, women are ruling and fighting just as much as the men are. Scythians, the Nords, all of these other spaces, we're seeing that women are fighting just as much as men are. Okay. So when we are and ruling just as much as men are, right? And when Egypt was not Greek, Egypt, through the Ptolemaic dynasty, had Greek rulers, but Egypt was not Greek. So when we're seeing this othering translate into gender othering, the next step that we see it translate into is religious othering. When we see a rise of monotheism, we see a rise of othering based on religion. At roughly 400 CE, we see Constantine in the Council of Nicaea. Constantine was never Christian, but he turns his nation into a Christian nation. And as he turns his nation into a Christian nation, they've already conquered half of the globe. So everybody underneath the Roman state becomes Christian. And everybody underneath the Roman state becoming Christian, it obliterates science and medicine. It takes science and medicine that has been around for thousands of years. Neanderthals had medicine and Homo erectus started science. So it takes science and medicine that has been around for thousands of years and it obliterates it in every place that Christianity rules. And it does this because Christianity believes that you're questioning God with science and you're playing God with medicine. So Christianity doesn't allow it. Now, Islam starts a couple hundred years after this. Now, Islam does not take the same thought process. Islam allows science and medicine to continue. So Christianity calls Islam sin for allowing science and medicine to continue. Christianity calls other spaces sinful because they have science and medicine within them, right? So when we're looking at this, we start to see roughly the early 1400s, this rise of idea of race. And when we start to see this idea of race rise, we start to see this idea rise in biblical thought process. This idea first starts on the idea that the children of Ham are marked by God, Ham being the son of Cain, are marked by God, and that this mark is dark skin. And so we start to see this idea that it is dark skin that is the mark of Ham, and therefore they are not the chosen of God, and that light skin means you are chosen by God, and therefore it's okay for you to dominate, control, or obliterate people who are of darker skin because obviously God has marked them. Now, of course, this is not scientific. Of course, this has no basis. In fact, this is religion. And religion at this point of time is trying to double down on the atrocities that they're doing, and they're trying to justify the atrocities that they're doing, right? So when we're seeing this, we're starting to see that the idea that race exists comes into play. When we see this landing of Columbus on the Taino people, of Abiyala, we see that this starts to take a shift. I'm sorry, can you still hear me? I just got a phone call and sometimes it'll mute me. Let me know that you can hear me. Yes, no. Okay, perfect. When we start to see, when we see Columbus land on the Taino people, at this point of time, again, we see that the start of races started roughly 50 to 100 years prior. The idea that racial categories exist or that different skin tones equate different categories in God's eyes exists for roughly 100 years. When you see that, what you're seeing is that it follows along the lines of religion as well, right? So most of the people in these darker spaces at this point of time follow either animistic thought processes, indigenous thought processes, or they're Islamic, or they are Buddhist, Taoist. They're in Asia, and they're in spaces that they're darker of skin and their religion is different. So we can equate that evil with the fact that they have all of these other things like science and medicine that are a sin. When we see this, what we're seeing is that Columbus, looking at the Taino people, literally calls them the children of God. The Taino people are considered as close to God's nature as you can get. They're godlike in their behavior. They're without sin. Okay, you see this documented all up and down the first 100 years of slaughter and capture along the eastern seaboard of the United States and Mexico, or not Mexico, of Turtle Island and Abiyala. You see this slaughtering coming alongside this documentation of advanced medicine, advanced science, lack of disease, and them being as close to God as you can get. They're without things like violence and rape for the most part. And because we're seeing this, and because they cannot say, well, obviously you're sinning with science and medicine because of the fact that God doesn't want science and medicine, and yet you seem so godlike otherwise, they have to start coming up with other ideas. This is around the same time, slightly before this, we see the doctrine of discovery take into effect, right? The doctrine of discovery comes about slightly before Columbus lands on the Taino people. After Columbus lands on the Taino people, the doctrine of discovery leaps. Now we have a whole new land that the doctrine of discovery applies to, right? And so when we see this, we see that the doctrine of discovery doubles down on we must Christianize all of these people. And unless they're Christianized, they're evil. Race ties into this. You see this idea that being darker of skin equates being children of Ham, and race tying into it. And you see that as it translates through, this double down comes about. Now, this lasts for about 400 years, 300 years under biblical thought process, under the thought process that this is the children of Ham. We must bring them back to the church, right? They're so innocent and they're so great and they're so sweet, but we must bring them back to the church and make them God's children through violence, through hate. As we're seeing this progress in the world, we're seeing that Europeans at this point of time start to understand the theory of evolution in the mid 1800s. In the mid 1800s, roughly 1850, we see the first discovery of Neanderthal. This is the first body that we have found of a skeletal remains that we have found of anything outside of us. So this is our first idea that there are other humans on the planet prior to us. When we see this, it's at the same time Darwin's theory of evolution is coming out. Darwin isn't the only person with that theory of evolution. There's an entirely different human being who came up with the theory first, but we all go off of Darwin. So when we see Darwin's theory of evolution come about the same time that we see the first discovery of Neanderthals, it roughly takes us 10 years to look at Neanderthal as another species of human instead of looking at Neanderthal as somebody who has serious morphology. Serious disease morphology in their skeletal structure. But once we understand that this is another human being, now we're starting to understand that God didn't create us and the world is not 6,000 years old. So now we develop the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution develops alongside two other theories, the theory of race and the theory of eugenics. And in the theory of race and the theory of eugenics, we develop this idea that certain groups of people are less evolved than other groups of people. And when we develop this idea that certain groups of people are less evolved than other groups of people, we categorize this by race. So we develop the theory of eugenics and the theory of race at the same time, which kind of confirms the biblical thought process, but it also justifies the atrocity that Europeans have been committing. This is their need to justify what they've been doing. If they can justify what they've been doing, then they can continue to do it. But if they can't justify what they've been doing, well, now you're just an ass, right? Now you've just been a horrific person and gone against everything your God taught you to do, anyways, right? So they can't allow it to not be justified. They have to have a justification for it. And so to justify their atrocities, they develop the theory of eugenics and they develop the theory of race. Now, the theory of race is developed with this idea that, like, they take literally pieces of paper and put paint swatches on them and they'll hold them up and compare them. The pencil test of the hair, the measurements with calipers. The most scientific process in this entire thing is the calipers that they use to measure, because they're not actually looking at the things that they really need to be looking at. We're seeing I didn't say religion was good. I said that they were thinking that their religion was good and they had to double it down. Just making sure. Okay. So when we are looking at these things, what we're seeing is that using the theory of eugenics and the theory of race, not based on a lot of scientific detail, they start to double down on this idea that anybody of specific races that they don't deem the higher quality races is therefore by right somebody who should be kept down. Now, when we're looking at this, we are looking at another form of othering. Now, race has been debunked. When they start using actual science like DNA and genomics and things like that, we have found that you are more genetically diverse within a primary population than you are between two primary populations, meaning the oldest population on the planet, the one with all the genomes, is the Khoi population or the San population of South Africa. This population has the oldest language in the world, and this population has all the genetics that you can find in the Homo sapiens species is within the Khoi population. So we know that this is the original population, and we know that this is the oldest population. When we're looking at the Khoi population, you can see that in the Khoi population, two people living next door to each other could have vastly different genetics. And yet, as I, living in the Khoi population, have genomes 1 through 50, somebody in Sweden is also going to have genomes 1 through 50. So when we're looking at the genomics, when we're looking at the whole genome of our species, and we're looking at the DNA and the genetics of specific groups, we can see that within a primary population, it is more genetically diverse than between two primary populations who are more likely to be genetically similar between those two populations. When you think about this logically, this makes sense to every single one of us because we all know that incest is bad. We all know that when genetic narrowing happens, mutations happen. So you must be genetically diverse within your primary population to not have inbred populations. So this makes perfect sense when you truly think about it. Of course, in the 1850s, they weren't truly thinking about it. They were looking for justification for their atrocity. So othering leads into racial othering. And we've held on to racial othering. We're still othering based on religion. We still other based on barbarians in the hills. This has moved forward, though. Once we have started to understand that othering based on race is problematic, we start to move on into othering based on other things. We look at othering based on immigration, othering based on houselessness, right? So currently today, especially here in the United States, well, we do still have a lot of racism, structural racism. Racism is very predominant in our population, even though race has been debunked. Well, we still have racism. We also have othering based on immigration. Immigrants are others, even though 99.9% of the United States population is immigrants. Unless you are Turtle Island indigenous person or Abayalian indigenous person, this is not your home and you're an immigrant. A welcome immigrant in some spaces, but still an immigrant. So even though most of the population is immigrants, we still other immigrants within our population. And we also other the houseless within our population. The houseless are people who have been exploited by the population, exploited by the higher ups until they can no longer be exploited. And once they're no longer exploitable, they become a husk. They become somebody who is put to the side, right? And when we see this putting to the side, right, this lack of being exploitable anymore, we start othering based on that lack of exploitability, right? So when we see the continuation of othering, we're absolutely, again, seeing something that is being used by the hierarchy, by the top level of a stratified hierarchy to convince you that this is not the problem your next door neighbor is. Your next door neighbor is not getting paid to protest. Your next door neighbor is not getting paid to do anything. And your next door neighbor is struggling as much as you are. The person on the street that's houseless is absolutely struggling as much as, if not more than you are. They're struggling from the same people. We're all struggling over this top 1%, this hierarchy that is hoarding everything from food to money to maintain their control. And their ability to maintain their control comes from making you believe that your next door neighbor is the problem so that you fight your next door neighbor instead of overturning a government that is fucking you over. Period. So we can see within this where the deification of narcissism comes about with the hierarchy and structure of stratified society, the rise of monoculture, the rise of cities, and where we have utilized that deification of narcissism to really create a society that has a lot of narcissistic traits within it. We can also see within this that othering is a means of control. That othering is a means of maintaining control over the lower levels of the population. Now, it doesn't matter if you're alt left or alt right. We all know that the government is out to get us. We all know it. Every single one of us sitting in this chat believes that the government is fucking us over. It doesn't matter which side you're on. You believe that the government is fucking you over. We know this. So if you start looking at your neighbor as the problem and start remembering that the government is the problem, then you can start changing it, right? We, in the last 3 years, have spent so much time getting told Antifa is getting paid. Do you really think that the government paid me jack shit to go on the streets? Right? Do you really think that they paid them anything? Do you think the alt-right is getting paid to go on the streets? The alt-right that protests, that thinks Antifa is getting paid. Did any of you get paid? The government isn't paying anybody to cause these problems. The government is trying to make you believe that they're paying people to cause these problems so that you will not attack the government that you know is the problem and will instead attack somebody else. Okay? This is also where we see this manufacture of the idea of evil. This comes back to that deification of narcissism. When we see this deification of narcissism happen with the first God kings, with the earliest stratification, with the earliest hierarchy, this deification of somebody who believes that they're a god, this deification of somebody who wants to have control, this deification of somebody who likes to hoard. Okay. When we see this deification, we end up seeing this translate down into the Bible and into organized religion on many levels. When we see this translate down, you can read the Bible and see the narcissism that is coming across in the God of the Bible. When you look at Exodus, New Oxford Annotated Edition, so one of the more correct translations. This one is the 5th edition. It's fully revised. It's very recent. And I'm going to point out a couple of passages from Exodus. Because for me, when I had to do this and I've read the Bible a couple times, so not really in depth because I don't like Christianity on any level. When I started reading this for a class, I started marking stuff because I went, that's narcissism. That's narcissism. That's a narcissistic parent. This is what I experienced as the child of a narcissistic parent. This is what I experienced as the wife of a narcissistic spouse. When we are looking at these, what we're seeing is, give me just a second so I can find the right passages. 4:21. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. See that you tell Pharaoh that he needs to do this, but I'll make Pharaoh not do it. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. I said to you, let my son go so that he may worship me, but you refuse to let him go. Now I will kill your firstborn son. Seven, 3. 7:2. You shall speak all that I command you and your brother. Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his land, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and bring my people, the Israelites, company by company, out of the land of Israel with acts of judgment. 10:20. But Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. 11:1. Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards, he will let you go from here. There's one. Then the Lord said to Moses, 10:1. Then the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his officials, in order that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I have made fools of the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, so that you may know that I am the Lord. Over and over, 9:7. But the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he would not let the people go. 9:12. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he would not listen to him, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. In the end, you see that Lord specifically says to Moses, I have done all of this so that you and your people will laud my praises for eternity. Several times you see that Pharaoh states, oh, you can go. It's okay. If you're just looking to worship, go ahead and go. And then Moses comes back the next day after Lord has spoken to Pharaoh. And Lord tells Moses, I hardened his heart. Go back and talk to him. He was going to let you go, but I told him not to. All of this is narcissistic parenting. Narcissistic parenting is telling a child to do something, telling somebody else that you told the child not to do something, and then punishing the child for doing it. That's narcissistic parenting, and it's all throughout your Bible. This is the deification of narcissism. This is the deification of narcissistic parenting, because we are told that we should be godlike. We are told that we are supposed to act in the manner that God wishes us to, that we are supposed to act like God, that we are supposed to be godlike, that a man is given his family as head of his family, God of his family, right? We are told these things over and over again. And the Bible that we follow, or some of us follow, right, has narcissistic parenting throughout it, right? This is the deification of narcissism. This is teaching us that to behave like a narcissist is appropriate behavior, because to behave like a narcissist is godlike behavior. So when we see this, we see not only the deification of narcissism, we see that othering is a means of control for those in power. And we also see this manufacturing of evil. We see this manufacturing of evil in things like the barbarians of the hills are out to get you. That other religion is evil because it sins. Okay. We see this manufacturing of evil when we see you must behave in a way that is evil to be godlike. This is a manufacturing of evil within us. Now, this doesn't mean that humans cannot be evil. Humans can be evil. I've known a few, right? What this means is is that it's not innate to us. And we are taught as a society that evil is innate, that we are all innately sinners and we must be washed clean of that sin, that we are all innately fallible. Their idea of perfection is pretty fucked up, anyways. We are taught that we are all innately wrong, and only through striving against the innate wrongness within us can we overcome it. Yet when we are taught that we're all innately wrong, all innately evil, and only in striving to be godlike can we overcome the innate evil that we all are, we're being taught to be evil, because narcissism is pretty much an epitome of evil, right? Narcissism doesn't care for anything else. Narcissism only sees, then they see themselves in somebody else. They have no compassion, they have no empathy, right? So we are being taught to use narcissistic tools. We are being taught that to be godlike is to behave in a narcissistic manner, that we're all evil and we should all behave in this specific manner. This shows us this evil being manufactured, along with the idea that your neighbor is the problem instead of them, right? This is where we get this deification of narcissism, othering as a means of control, and evil being manufactured, translating into where we're at today as a society and bringing violence into our society. Again, when we look at prior to 10,000 years ago, we see under 2% violence in skeletal remains. And it's not even definitive violence. It's a probability of a violent action, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that that's how that came about. It means that there's 5 different ways that it could have come about, and violence is one of the 5 different ways that it can come about. Yet at 10,000 years ago, when we see ownership of land starting and ownership of people starting, we start to see this rise of violence. Now, for me, this comes with taking away the autonomy of the planet. We are all a part of a biome. We are all intermixed and intertwined in this biome. We call this such things as the circle of life. We call this such things as, just the world around us. Biome is our later thought process, right? Thank you. This is why I like to leave comments on. Sometimes they can be really shitty. There are almost always people in my comments who have been here for a hot minute, and they can school you so easily that it's beautiful. And I just love watching that. Anyways, so when we see this rise of violence, we see that this rise of violence starts with this association that you can dehumanize things. Prior to this, we're all animistic. And by what I mean by animistic is that we believe the entire biome has as much autonomy as we do, that we're all equal within the biome. Most people don't understand that plants have language. Trees have language. Forests are little matriarchal clans to create a big nation. And they speak to each other through their roots. And they sit in little matriarchal clans, right? So we see that plants can hear themselves being chewed. Animals can't hear themselves being chewed if they're already dead, right? We see that everything within the biome has a function within the biome, has a niche that it fulfills within the biome. Everything created by the biome has a niche that it fulfills in the biome because the biome creates it to fulfill that niche. We are created by the biome. That's what evolution is. It's adapting to a space. And as we adapt to the space, it is that space creating us to fit that space. Our purpose, our niche, what we fulfill in this space as we are nurturing, communal, and creative is to tend that space, to make that space safer and more effective for all of that space. When we see the idea of monoculture, we start to see the idea that you can own land. And when we start to see the idea that you can own land instead of you belong to the land, that the land belongs to you, we start to see the autonomy of land being removed. We start to see land, the biome, removed from the idea that it's living. removed from the idea that it has its own rights, right? And when we start to remove that autonomy from the biome, from the land, from the animals, from the plants, when we start to remove its autonomy, it's a slippery slope. And we're able to remove our autonomy. We're able to remove other people's autonomy. Animal nature does not say the weak die and the strong survive. That's not what animal nature states at all. Many animals actually care for their weak. Think of a herd of buffalo, a herd of water buffalo, surrounding their old, their injured, and their children with their strong adults on the outside when a lion is coming. They are absolutely protecting their weak. Elephants, absolutely, right? So when we are looking at that, what we are absolutely seeing is that, like all the animals, we protect our weak. There is not an animal out there that throws its weak to the wayside. Not a single one that throws its weak to the wayside. Now, there are animals that will eat other animals within its space, absolutely. Oftentimes, this is because they're diseased or there's something wrong with them. And it's not that they're weak, it's that if they propagate the species, they'll propagate the species with mutations or issues, as well as the fact that they'll drag the species down, as well as the fact that if I let you live in pain, what good am I doing you? It is better to kill you now than to let you live a lifetime of pain. Which is more violent? To let you live a lifetime of misery or to give you a quick death? Right? So when we're looking at this, we definitely see that the idea of kill the weak is not something we see anywhere within the biome. This is another thing that you're indoctrinated into. This is another thing that is part of your indoctrination into this belief that we should be killing the weak. We should be othering people. Everybody else is the problem. It's not the 1%. It's not those on top. Okay. I don't think billions have to die. We currently have a generation that's done having kids. A lot of Zoomers, I can never remember my generations right. A lot of Zoomers aren't having children. A lot of millennials aren't having children. We currently have a population that is tending more towards sex that doesn't actually propagate. And we currently have several generations that are tending more towards sex that doesn't propagate than towards sex that does propagate. So if this continues in a generation, as the boomers and the silent generation dies out, we're going to see that our population starts shrinking, right? When we see mass plagues, this is the biome helping us to reset, right? When we see things along those lines, when we see mass disease, well, we've caused most of the mass disease. Cities causes disease. From our very first cities are, except for cities that we have found here in the Turtle Island. Cities here in Turtle Island prior to colonization have a tendency to have been cleaner. There's not a lot of disease within those cities, but that's because they live within the biome. They lived as a part of the biome instead of a step above the biome. When you look at cities based on agriculture, when you look at cities in Europe and you look at cities in Western culture or Western thought, all of those cities are heavily diseased. And they're heavily diseased because they didn't have waste systems. Even today, when we have waste systems, it's still very heavily diseased because we're living on top of each other, right? So when it's not safe for wealthy enough to have kids, it is about safety and wealth, absolutely. A part of it, though, is many people are like, I'm going to have a kid that's going to be dead because we've got 7 more years to turn around climate destruction, or we're all going to die off. We're the only species in the entire timeline of the planet that's ever caused its own extinction, and we're working on it, right? So climate destruction is absolutely coming. Climate change happens. We've had climate cycles for the entirety of this planet's history. The entirety of the time this planet has existed, we've had climate cycles. Climate destruction starts with Engazol. And we absolutely see climate destruction starting with Engazol. We see things that people name climate destruction that are not climate destruction People are talking about, the great forest fires or the fires that would be lit here in Turtle Island. But those fires that were lit here in Turtle Island were to protect and build the biome. Pine trees don't actually create new pine trees unless they've been through a fire. The fire itself opens the pine cones and releases the seeds, right? So the fires that were set here were tending fires, right? So when we look at all of these different things, what we see is that there are things that we can picture as being violent acts or being destructive acts that are healthy acts. It is a healthy act to burn the underbrush of a forest in a controlled burn so that the forest stays healthy. It is a healthy act for an animal to kill a young or an older animal that is highly diseased, so that they don't spread that disease, right? So that they're not in pain. These are healthy acts. They can appear on the surface to be violent or destructive acts, but they are not violent or destructive acts. They are, in fact, acts of nonviolence. They are, in fact, acts of creation instead of destruction. So we can absolutely see that there are different ways that you can go about it, right? We won't branch off into anything. And the reason that we won't branch off into anything is because we don't isolate. Speciation comes from many forms. Most of those forms require isolation. The only speciation that doesn't require isolation is speciation through convergence. And that would mean that we had other human species here on the planet currently, and that we were intermixing with those other human species to create a new species through convergence. Since we don't have other human species here on the planet currently, it's not going to work like that. We won't speciate again. We might become something unrecognizable to us today, but that will be the evolution of our current species. It won't be a new species. And it will be probably because of climate destruction and things like that. Absolutely. And we are still evolving. We're always evolving. So this is where you can see that we have deified narcissism, both within our religion and in the way that we parent and in what we expect out of society. We've made narcissistic traits godlike. We treat narcissistic traits as if they're positive instead of the negative that they are. That with this deification of narcissism and this rise of stratification, this rise of hierarchy, we see a rise of violence. And when we see this rise of violence, we see this manufacturing of evil through things like othering, through things like controlling the masses, through things like making sure that the hierarchy stays in place. So currently, Homo florensis was discovered on the island of Flores in 2003. The doctorate of anthropology, who has been studying Homo florensis this entire time, recently has published the fact that within the last 50 years, there have been sightings of Homo florensis on the island of Flores in Indonesia. So they're currently investigating as to whether or not Homo florensis still exists. There are possibilities that there are other hominin species or other Homo species that still exist on this planet. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Most people know that the Pacific Northwest is where you get the vast number of Bigfoot sightings. There's even evidence out there that supports this. In fact, some of the gigantic evidence out there, the evidence out there for giants actually supports Bigfoot as well, right? And if you are from the Pacific Northwest, you know that there are literally thousands upon thousands of acres of land in this area that has never seen a Homo sapien. So there is absolute possibility that there is another species that exists here of Homo, right? When we're looking at those things, these are absolute possibilities. I'm not going to say like I 100% this is down, right? Like I don't know for certain. There are possibility. There are even a probability maybe, but I don't know for positive. So they're not things that I'm going to like double down on. This was factual, right? But I do come from the Pacific Northwest, and I don't know a single person in the Pacific Northwest who doesn't go, yeah, Bigfoot's probably out there. Because we know, like, I've spent half of my life in the Cascade Mountains. We know, like, there's spaces that are still untouched. We know, right? There's possibility there. So when we're looking at that, we are absolutely seeing that there is a possibility of other humans out there. We'll see. Um, but unless those other humans come about, we will not have a speciation through convergence. We would have to have a speciation through isolation, which would mean maybe if the Sentinelese stay on their island for another 100,000 years. It takes 50, 60, 100,000 years for speciation through isolation. It's not something that happens in 10,000 years. It happens over an extensive period of time. And so an adaptation takes 2,500 years currently, because an adaptation takes 100 generations. And in 100 generations, we're seeing adaptation from like the equatorial region and stuff like that. JJ, do me a favor and don't use all caps unless you're doing something like you were trying to point out that somebody was being negative. If you use all caps and something like that, hey, this person needs to be muted, that's fine. Other than that, please don't use all caps. It's really difficult for me and it's really difficult for the moderators in here. We try and keep the moderators the only people that are using the all caps, just so you're aware. Well, there are pyramids across the planet too. There are pyramids in so many different regions across the planet. They just recently discovered pyramids in the Iraqi desert, I think. I can't remember exactly where, but they just recently discovered new sets of pyramids. Like there's pyramids everywhere. The pyramids, though, don't look the same everywhere. All the pyramids have different styles to them, different things going on with them. Pyramids happen because the best way to get rock to stay on top of each other is to stack it in a pyramid, right? The most stable way to get rock to stack it on top of it, to build higher, is a pyramid, right? And so pyramids happen everywhere. Basically because maths, right? Basically because maths, and everywhere has maths. Some of us are good, some of us are bad. I'm bad. Everywhere has maths, right? So pyramids are pretty much everywhere. They don't correlate with each other, though. They're not because some ancient space came out and populated the entire globe with their knowledge, like the Atlantis thought process doesn't support, right? But we do see that pyramids are everywhere, right? And we do see that a lot of the pyramids are, I know you're not saying, I'm just saying, I always have to double down on that because some people will take it there, and I always make sure I double down on it. We are seeing that some of the pyramids across the globe are way older than the pyramids in Egypt, right? We are seeing, as we start looking and actually get away from the old white man thought process within science and archaeology and anthropology, and we see indigenous people and Black people and different people in different regions, indigenous people in the Americas and Black people within the Americas, and different peoples in different regions who are actually endemic to those regions, indigenous to those regions, actually coming into archaeology, anthropology, and science. We start to see this shift from that old academic white thought process that is very much descendant from the Greeks. And if it can't be traced back to the Greeks, nobody buys it. We see this shift into a new thought process and a new understanding. And as we see this shift into a new thought process and a new understanding, we're starting to gain more information. We're starting to gain new understandings. Like people have been here in Turtle Island and Abiyala for 52,000 years instead of 12,000 years, right? As we see these shifts and we start to see these new understandings coming from people who are not white academics, not Western white academics, coming in and kind of causing upheaval in the white academic thought process that's actually very inbred. Like when I took philosophy in college, I was like, this shit's more inbred than the Habsburg jaw. If you can't trace it back through several different philosophers all the way back to Aristotle, then you're not considered a philosopher. And it's like, dude, maybe some outside influence would help. Like, this shit's inbred as fuck. So when we start to see that shift away and we start to get new blood and new thought process and new ideas, right? We see that these new thought processes and these new ideas shift our understanding. And it's echo chamber, right? And again, as we were talking about in the very beginning, when we were talking about Homo sapien and Neanderthal meeting, when you live your entire life within a box, if you've lived your entire life in the same 12 miles The only culture you understand is the culture within that same 12 miles. The only prospects or thought processes that you understand are within that same 12 miles. When you have somebody who's from 12 miles across the globe comes in and meets, their thought processes and your thought processes meeting explodes both of your understanding. It gives you both great uh, aptitude for understanding new things. This is why people state that everybody should learn another language. When you learn another language, it actually modifies the pathways of your brain. It actually modifies the way that you understand things. This is why people say that you should learn a new culture and live in a new culture, because when you learn in a new culture and you live in a new culture, it shifts your understanding. It gives you broader knowledge. And then in that broader knowledge, you can create more, right? We are just innately curious as a species. Curiosity may have killed the cat, but it does everything for us. Curiosity is why you have a cell phone, right? Curiosity is 100% what makes us who we are, right? We have to have the nurture and we have to have community. Yet there are many other creatures out here who have nurture and community. How beautiful. Who have nurture and have community that don't have the curiosity that we have. And it is the curiosity that we have that adapts our adaptations. It is a curiosity that we have that gives us broader knowledge. It is a curiosity that we have that took us from the Acheulean hand axe to a point, an arrowhead, to a phone, right? It is the curiosity in us that took us from Homo erectus's ability to control fire to having centralized heat, right? It is curiosity that does everything for us. We have to have that curiosity along with the nurture and the communal, because it is those three things together that gives us the ability to tend the biome in a positive manner. We nurture the community of our biome, understanding that the entirety of the biome is our community, not just the other human beings, but the animals and the plants as well, because we are just animals. We understand that we must nurture the entire community of the biome, and that our creative nature gives us those new tools to nurture new things, new tools and ways to do new things, right? So that we can understand that if we plant squash and corn and beans together, that they're nurturing each other, right? It is those creative, curious, communal, nurturing behaviors that puts us where we are today, right? It is what lends us the strength of mind. The brilliance that we have comes from those things. Okay, so that is the list of the things that I was talking about today. I'm going to go ahead and read through, not scroll back through, but I'll go ahead, and if anybody has any questions on it, any information that they'd like to give, I'm totally welcome to hear those things. Again, I don't put people up on a panel for most of these, just because of the fact that it ends up getting taken over sometimes, and then my purpose here doesn't go out, right? It doesn't end up being what I want it to be. And B, it can be very hard for me. I absolutely don't invite people up into a panel that I don't know, because I'm doing this because I can't leave my house, because everybody around me, not everybody, so many people around me have bought into the indoctrination that when I leave my house, I end up getting attacked and I end up getting hurt. And so I don't leave my house. So I do this in part. There are many reasons, but in part because if I can get people to understand these things, I become safer. There are some very altruistic reasons for this, right? That I become safer. And one of those things that I have a problem with is things like social media, and allowing people up in a panel and stuff can make it very difficult for me, because then it's a threat in my threat matrix. In the beginning, basically what we were talking about was what I expect in my space, like comments and things like that. And we talked a little bit about speciation and our speciation, right? What we were talking about with our speciation is that we, as a species, proved the theory of convergence this last year. So we had about 5 different theories of how species speciate. Apparently, I'm having problems. We have about 5 different theories of how species speciate. One of those was theoretical into this last year. And the one that was theoretical into this last year was the idea that species will speciate through convergence. Not in my neighborhood. I stopped leaving my house last year. I think it was last year. Maybe it was 2021. So I'm a war vet. I have military sexual trauma from being locked up in a tent by my platoon sergeant for 6 weeks in Kuwait. And then I married a narcissist after the military, and he was a military veteran too. He was not a war vet, did not like the fact that I was a war vet. I did not get treatment for any of my shit until after I got divorced, because he was very adamant that there was nothing wrong with me. Everything was wrong with him. Not mentally, just physically, but he had no mental problems. And then I started standing front lines after I got divorced. I was in Standing Rock, and I was in Portland for 2020. In 2021, had one day where I went out. My brother was living with us, and he had a big old dog, and I walked the dog, and there was like this 300-foot by 5-foot wide thing of ivy that the dog would go over and shit in. And I'm not walking in that. There's needles in that. There's shit in that. I'm not going to do anything. The dog took a shit in the ivy, and I walked him home, and somebody saw me and started freaking. Well, this is actually the second time. Somebody started freaking out on me, screaming at me and yelling at me. This big guy, like probably over 6 foot and definitely over 300-400 pounds, just screaming violently at me. It didn't even stop until I turned the corner and he could no longer see me. A couple months prior to this, I'm getting ready. One of my cousins comes and picks me up to take me downtown. We're dropping my sons off because I don't have custody of my sons. I had part-time custody of my sons. He's picking me up. My car broken down. We're going to go downtown for protesting. He sees us leaving, and he comes out with his Blue Lives Matter flag and starts screaming at me and my children and my cousin. When I told him he needed to stop and started yelling at him back, he freaked out because his daughter was asleep right next to where he's screaming. And then the day that the guy attacked me with the dog, we went to the grocery store later that day. I was with my partner, but my partner was on the phone and so wasn't paying attention. And somebody physically attacked me in the grocery store, ran into my car, and started screaming at me because they didn't like the way that I was going in the pathways on the thing. I don't remember if it was right before that or right after that. We go out to the bar, and one of my partner's friends can be very loud and aggressive. They weren't trying to talk negatively towards me. They were talking negatively about their partner and their prior partner, and the way that they were talking was very narcissistic. Like, it was very problematic, and they were screaming it in my face, not like directed towards me, but they were screaming about it in my face, trying to tell me. It made me uncomfortable, so I left the bar to breathe. And when I came back in and sat down, my partner started rubbing my shoulders because they knew that I was uncomfortable. And some guy came from across the bar and started rubbing my shoulders as well. Some strange man I had never met. People either feel that they can scream and yell at me, or they feel that they can touch me when I go out into public. And so I don't do public. It's not my neighbor. Well, the one was my neighbor. But usually it's not my neighbors. Usually it's strangers. Usually it's people I don't fucking know. And that's after being in the military and being attacked constantly in the military for, the trauma that happened, ended up being, the sergeant was never punished for it. He was promoted for it. And my entire unit then spent the next 2 years attacking me for what he had done to me. And I had never tried to tell anybody about what he had done. My platoon leader my squad leader told me that I needed to tell our higher ups. And so I told our higher ups, and then the entire company attacked me for a year and a half over it. So I have problems with those who possess a penis for the most part. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love men. I've raised 2. I have a couple of great fathers. I have a great partner. Yet I don't, for the most part, I know that many men are indoctrinated into this thought process that they're owed me. They're owed a good woman. And because they're a good man, though their idea of good man isn't my idea of good man, they're owed a good woman. And so therefore they can touch me or do whatever the fuck they want. And I've been assaulted a lot outside of those. Those are just within the last couple of years. And so with all of those things, I'm just like, when I don't hate, there's not hate in me. I'm not the type, that's just never been my ability. Like, I'm not somebody who is hateful. If you piss me off, I can be cutting. I don't ever try and be cruel, but I can be cutting unintentionally. I don't hate, right? Like, it's just not who I am. Because I was raised very, well, first in an indigenous community until I was 5, and then very isolated. I very much had this, I've always loved humans. Like, I do this because I love humans. I do this because if I can show people how loving and beautiful and nurturing and communal and creative that we are, then maybe I can change how you feel about yourself and how you feel about the world around you to promote my safety, right? Yet it's also the fact that I very much love humanity. I don't hate men. I hate what men have been indoctrinated into. I don't hate women. I hate what women have been indoctrinated into, right? And so it's very much about the fact that I absolutely would much rather help change people's minds to keep myself safe, right? And so it's not about hate. It's about fear. It's about fear. I have had periods in my life that I was angry. I was extremely angry all through 2020. I was mad. I couldn't breathe, and I was mad all through 2020. And it wasn't directed at any people in specific. It was directed at groups. But that's the only time in my life, that and basic training have been the only times in my life I've even been angry on a regular basis. I'm not an angry person either, right? And it is the willful ignorance. It's the willful ignorance in the indoctrination. We've all been indoctrinated into so many falsities. Like, we're indoctrinated into the idea that women are weaker than men. Men's upper body physical strength is greater than women's upper body physical strength. Women's lower body physical strength is greater than men's lower body physical strength. These are averages. This does not mean all. It doesn't even mean the majority. It means on average, men have greater muscular attachments on their upper body, and on average, women have greater muscular attachments on their lower body. Yet if you look at the two, which one is able to withstand more, right? So which one is stronger in the end, right? Yet we're all indoctrinated into the idea that you can't hit girls because girls are weak, which allows women to beat the shit out of men and men not to throw a hit back, and tells us that girls are weak. But girls aren't weak. We're strong as fuck, right? So we're all indoctrinated in the sweetest and most loving of ways sometimes into these ideas that are complete and utter falsities, right? So we really have to take a look at what the indoctrination is, right? What the thought processes are, right? And how we can shift those. Well, not only do we have the babies, but generally we carry the babies. Generally, we have greater strength over longer distance for hauling and carrying than males do. Generally, or on average, right? And again, average does not mean even majority. It means average, right? And yes, and it's totally that. Instead of teaching us not to hit girls, teach people not to hit, right? Never hit unless you need to get the fuck away. The only time you should ever be violent towards another person is if you are pinned in a space and you need to get the fuck away, right? If somebody's pinned you to a wall, punch the fuck out of them. But until somebody's pinned you to a wall, never hit, right? So, and when we look at it as don't hit humans instead of don't hit women because they're weaker, hi Kitty, then we can make sure that we are providing for all of us, and we're much more factual within it, and we're getting rid of the violence that is not natural to us, that has been indoctrinated into us, right? So when we can look at those things and put all of those things together, we can understand where that shift is going. I don't know. I'm not necessarily adopting. I have 6, but I am always an auntie and always an uncle and always a grandparent to anybody who needs it. I think that we should all be, though. I'll be your auntie. Kenny is like 15 and lives in an entirely different country, and unfortunately probably won't be here for many years. And that's why Kenny calls me mom. But I'll be auntie. I can totally be auntie. I don't think that eating animals is ethical or unethical. I believe that the way we farm animals is unethical, right? I believe that Western agriculture and the way that we deal with animals is extremely unethical. Eating animals in and of itself is not unethical. I personally, again, raised indigenous. For me, when I hunt, I've hunted most of my life. I don't hunt right now because I actually I have a trigger pull issue now. I have an auto close on my eyes, so I can't hit. I've gotten better over the last couple of years, but I had a few years where I couldn't hit a target right, and so I won't actually go out and hunt anymore because I could not risk injuring something and not killing it. But I have hunted the vast majority of my life. My mother has raised animals in an extremely ethical and humane way the vast majority of my life, and so I have butchered animals there. For me, it is about, for me, I can taste in the meat if you're looking at something that's been farmed unethically, right? I can taste that in the meat, right? So when I'm looking at things like that, I do not believe that the eating of animals is unethical. I believe that the way that we grow animals currently is unethical, right? And I personally believe, and science backs me on this, that we are omnivores and that we need both plant matter and animal matter to be healthy. Now, I know people who can't eat meat because they're allergic to it. Like it causes the sweat that they have to cause allergic outbreaks. Like if they sweat, the byproduct of meat, it causes an allergic reaction. With that, I personally feel that I know people that are like that. That can't eat meat, that get sick from not eating meat, but would get sick if they ate meat. Like they don't have enough proteins because they're not eating meat and they need those animal fat proteins, and yet they can't eat meat because it would cause an allergic reaction, right? I also know people that, I mean, my mom went vegetarian, I think, until I was about 4 when she was pregnant with my sister, 3 or 4. And she had to start eating meat because she wasn't getting enough, no matter how many vitamins and minerals she put in her body or how many nut proteins she put in her body, she wasn't getting enough. So, and yet that's the other thing. Like I can taste in meat the problems, right? And so living in a city currently, I don't have access to meat in the way that I used to have access to meat that was very ethical. And because of that, I eat less meat. Or when I eat meat, I actually talk to the meat when I eat it. I'm so sorry. I love you so much. Thank you so much for all you've done. I'm sorry that your life was so shitty. I hope that the other side is better, to make it comfortable for me to eat meat, right? So, yet I think that we have the same problem with the plants that we eat too. We raise our plants in an extremely unethical manner. Monoagriculture is extremely unethical for the plants as well, right? So when we're looking at that, when we're like, okay, we can't do this with the meat, we need to understand that plants have as much of a soul as meat does. Like that tree outside has as much of a soul, autonomy, and as much of a place in the biome as the dog that I'm sitting with, right? And plants can hear you eating them. They literally scream in pain when they are being eaten, right? So if plants are literally screaming in pain while they're being eaten, but you've killed the meat and it's dead and it's not screaming anymore, which one's less ethical, right? I don't believe that the way that we raise food on any level is an ethical way of raising food. And so I do my best to ensure that I can access food that is humanely raised, no matter what kind of food it is. And I do my best to ensure that I do what I've always been taught: give thanks and utilize everything I have. Right. So, and then I'm going to take off because I've only got a little bit longer here because I've got to go and do some stuff. Hello, Lovity. I haven't seen you in a minute.
Hey, I've been doing the homeschool thing with my kids, so I had to pull back a little bit, just a little bit. Okay, so there's a new study out. I don't know if you've read it or not, but the noises that plants make, they make them just as loud as human speech. They're just on a different frequency than what we can hear. So they click. It's like they used machines to like record it. It's just as loud as human speech. And you can, and they think that certain animals can hear it, and they know, like they're crying out to be cared for or whatever. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was told growing up that broccoli might have a nervous system, right? So I just felt guilty when I ate broccoli. But I am a big meat eater. If I don't get it, I could die. I get anemic. That's part of the reason why I eat ice. Everybody knows I eat a lot of ice. I low iron, low protein, so like I need that. But like obviously, yeah, and yes, you can tell the difference in how the animal was kept.
Oh yeah.
And taken care of.
Oh yeah. Well, and I was raised, because well, when we were living in the community that we were living in the Fidalgo Islands in the Pacific Northwest, we gleaned most of our food, and we did a lot of dumpster diving, and we went down to like the docks, and we would get our seafood from down there. So most of the food that we had was all stuff that we had ethically harvested, right? Other than, of course, the dumpster diving. But I was taught then that, you utilize every part of it and you kill it humanely. And then when we moved in the woods and I learned to hunt, because I started hunting at like 5 and tracking at like 5. And when I learned that, I was taught from that moment that, when we kill an animal, you make sure, first of all, that you kill it clean, right? There's a lot of reasons.
Quick, painless.
Yeah. And then you make sure that you give thanks to that animal for what it's given to you. And then you utilize literally every scrap of that animal, and anything that you can't utilize because you just can't utilize it, you make sure returns to the forest so that something else can utilize it, right? And that's for me, like that shift into eating store-bought food was really difficult. I remember being a teenager and living in a recovery house, like a clean and sober recovery house as a teenager. And it was the first time that I really ate a lot of processed food, and I couldn't stand it. We went on this trip and I was like, could we please buy some food that's not processed for the trip? Because I can't handle any more processed cheese. Like I can't handle any more of this heavily processed stuff. Right. So I've always, you can totally taste it. And not only can you totally taste it, it doesn't feed you as well, right? Like it doesn't sustenance as well to me.
Right, and your digestive tract and your blood pressure and everything is going to be affected. Like we all know that too much salt is bad, but a little bit of salt is good. So like somewhere along the line, we had a good balance, right?
Yeah,
we had a good balance, and we were fine. What had happened was is we started making all these processed meats and stuff, and whereas once in a while, when our body's out of whack, a little bit is actually good for you. It's okay. If you're low on salt, whatever. But too much all the time is horrific. It's for your body. It just it taxes it. All that lunch meat that's been processed and into a goo and then recooked into patties and sliced up, from the gel that it was or whatever. And we all like a good sandwich, but if the meat is over processed, it's over processed. It doesn't count. I don't know if you've ever had a diabetic test. The sugar test. Funny story. When I was a younger woman and I was going in to get my 3-hour glucose while I was pregnant, they said, well, don't eat anything. And I know there's a lot of diabetics in my family, but I really hadn't been given the lowdown because I wasn't full blown diabetic yet. So I always understood, okay, well, protein isn't sugar, right? So being pregnant at the time, I was super hungry, right? So they said don't eat anything. I'm like, oh, they must mean sugar and carbs. I'm not going to eat sugar and carbs. I'm going to eat this hot dog. So that didn't that that's still sugar.
Yeah, yeah,
The body processes all that salt the same as sugar. So yeah, it's all the stuff that we do to it, and whereas raw meat isn't necessarily the best for us. Um, it's still I had a gentleman, we were arguing the definition of white people, people who identify as white, and I was not saying anything hateful. I don't have anything. All of us are beautiful and precious on this planet, okay, and we all have some place that we're indigenous to. I was just simply saying, why identify with the homogenized version of what you are, instead of, like, if you're German, you have a cool history there, or if you're English, you have a history there. You have an ethnicity. Everyone has an ethnicity. You don't have to identify as white per se. That's a made up thing, and it wasn't necessarily made up for a good thing. It doesn't really help you. Not really. Not really, truly. You got every one of us has millions of years of evolution behind where and who we are today. Okay,
yeah,
and if we ate more like our ancestors, I'm not saying go out to a cave. I'm not saying clean your food. I'm saying that if you eat foods that are indigenous to places where your people derive from, your body has millions of years of evolution adapted to that food. You'll process it better. You'll be healthier. You'll be happier.
yeah. Well, and I think they've done a lot of studies on that too. And I think that when we're looking at like, you know, returning to indigenous tending, right? Returning to indigenous gardening, returning to indigenous food sources. That's one of the things that's often talked about, is the fact that having foods that are indigenous to a space, those foods are going to provide more, and having foods that are seasonal is better for our body too. We've talked about that a little bit before, when we've talked about the fact that, having a monocrop being a part of every food item that you have, from the chips to the, tacos, to the, like having corn and everything, or having wheat in everything that you eat, is actually, very unhealthy for us, right? And so when we
Right.
talk about those things, that understanding that eating foods that are from where your ancestors are from, or, and this works if you've spent a couple of generations in a space too, right? Like if you've spent, it's
Yeah.
not that you've become indigenous to that space, because you have to be a part of the land to become indigenous to that space. You've got to belong to the land to become indigenous to that space. And you have to commune with the indigeneity of that space, right? But your body becoming and adapting to that space, you start that food adaptation within a few generations. So even if you are European, but you're living on the East Coast, and your ancestors have been living on the East Coast since the 1600s, you're not indigenous to that space. And I'm not telling you that. You can eat the foods in that space, because your body has already started adapting to the foods of that space, as long as you are maintaining indigenous foods in that space and eating it on a yearly cycle, and making sure there's a variety of foods in that space.
Well, it's like they say. Okay, so if you have allergies, the first thing anybody with a Wikipedia degree or Google PhD is going to tell you that you need to try some local honey, right? And that's because it desensitizes you to the pollen in the area, because it's got a little bit of that pollen in it. So you take a little dose of it, and then and it doesn't work the first season. It never works the first season. It starts to work the second season, and it gets better through the years. But you take a spoonful of the local honey, and so, as you were saying, if you want to adapt to the land, don't sit there in your high rise, in your fluffy shoes or whatever, and your bottled water from the glaciers of such and so. Drink the water in the area, eat the food in the area that was grown there. In order for you to do well on that diet, you have to be touching, breathing, drinking, existing in the area with the things in it, not in a bubble in the area. Okay, not having everything shipped to you, be part of it. Now it's not going to happen in one generation, two, three. I mean, it takes time to adapt, right?
Yeah.
But like, if the best results, just get down in the dirt with everything and everyone.
Touch it, feel it,
Work,
taste it, smell it,
yeah,
become a part of it. I feel that so much.
yeah.
It makes me actually think of one of my favorite bits from George Carlin when he's talking about swimming in the Potomac. And he's like, we don't get sick. We built up our fucking immune systems to everything, you know? I don't get sick. Though you who are out there sanitizing everything and making sure every single germ goes away, are constantly getting sick because your body is not building up an immune system. And of course, he was much funnier saying it than I could ever be. Yeah, I remember that from like 20, 30 years ago and thinking that
that does not mean go out and lick doorknobs and mess with COVID. That's not what she's saying.
Or not get vaccinated, or not take utilization of the tools that we have been able to develop through an understanding. Most of these,
I think people go, oh, my body is a beautiful, wondrous thing, so I don't need to do anything to it. Here's the thing, Billy Bob, put the banjo down, listen carefully. Your brain is part of your body, okay? All of our brains are part of our body, so therefore, when we think of new and better ways to do things, that's also your wonderful body doing things for you. Trust it. Have faith in it. The community that you live in, it's part of you. You're part of it, or you should be. And that means the person who came up with that idea, when UGG came up with fire, okay, everybody else did not go, we're not touching that. He's sitting over there eating a roast and it smells good, but it's new, so we ain't going to do it. No, it smelled good. They came close. They trusted UGG because UGG was really smart.
Yeah, absolutely. He came up with something brilliant and it made us all warm and gave us all food.
Yes.
You know, like it made our lives better. And because he came up with something that made our lives better, we all went, oh, thank you. Hey, I came up with this yesterday. Check this shit out. I love your fire. This will work with that. Like, you know.
Yeah, we're communal creatures. That's why we're communal creatures. They say groupthink is bad, but I don't know what else to call this other than just, sociological advancement. This is part of us as animals, the advancements that we make scientifically and the discoveries that we make, and coming together and standing upon the shoulders of genius is a very human thing to do.
Absolutely.
To reach new heights.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and we have to remember that where we are now came from our ancestors, period. Like everything that we are now everything we are now is built on fire. It's Homo erectus. Like every technology, every thought comes from
I had someone who
fire.
Identified as white say that it was white culture. I was like, no, UGG did that. It's Homo erectus. That was Homo erectus culture. we all stole it from them.
Well, but they would be proud of us. On our ancestors that are sitting down watching, the man who created fire, or the husbandry, the keeping of, the holding of fire, is just, oh my God, you built phones? You can talk into little screens with that shit? Damn, I did good. Damn, you did good. The man who created fire is back there going, well done. Well done. That energy is still here. That thought process, that love, that creation is still here, right? That soul is still here and intermixed. And as long as that soul or energy, or however you want to view our conscious, is still around on some level or another, his is watching what we've done with it. And I mean, there's probably some things he's watching that we did with it, like nukes, and going, what the fuck did you do? Right? How could you do that? Yet
UGG's wife is sitting there like,
what were you thinking? I take
that one stones away.
I hope that we can get to a space that we can remember that. We are so indoctrinated into these little thought processes, into these little beliefs that just kind of really affect our everyday life, that we can even separate it into, and I hear it all the time, everything you are comes from us. Bullshit. Bullshit. First of all, World Wide Web, that's Hedy Lamarr, motherfucker. She is not male. Second of all, rubber is from South America. Like, come on. Like, everything you are is not built on you. You are not that why you think you're a right to be that egotistical? What makes you feel that special?
I don't know why they don't stop and think about some of these things that all of the cultures across the world, you know, shared. Things like fire, things like community, things like caring for our young ones properly, and love, and you know, the good cool things that everybody unanimously developed on their own, right? Like the things, and instead of saying we are going to fight over who did this first, why don't we all just say, damn, it was such a good idea that we all had to think of it in order to move on, so we better all just do it.
Yeah. I for me, it's as simple as looking at the structure of the words that we use to define our society and looking at the meaning behind those words sometimes. And that's where I'm like, it's in the definition of the word. Why do you think being communal is worse than being capital to be exploited? Like, why do you...
If you look at the amount of food that is thrown away, right, and resources, not just food, but stuff that we need, you know, and some places, these big corporations have told their employees, you throw things away and then you pour bleach on it or ammonia or whatever. Make sure that nobody wants it once it's in the trash, because, you know, we want people to have to spend the money whether they have it or not. Here's the thing. Those people are causing themselves to have to raise their prices. This is, you know, instead of just saying, hey, we were going to throw this away anyway, why don't we just have cheaper prices? We could be driving prices down, but like collectively we're really not, and we're kind of all going downhill as a result, aren't we?
Yeah.
From greed, and greed stems from fear, doesn't it? Of not, you know, having the most or you know, anything in the end anyway, which means that they don't really have faith that they could provide for themselves if you know, bow came to arrow, you know. Right. Those are the people who would not be able to catch anything. It's sad.
100%. 100%. And I feel like when we separate this into the idea of being able to put a value on what you provide that is not tangible. Money is not a tangible object. It's something that we've literally created, right? And the value that we put on it. And this is in every step of the progress of an economic system. It is something we have created out of thin air. And yet we make that economic system literally the value of our entire life. And when we make that economic system literally the value of our entire life, and then we manufacture scarcity, right? Like food or bleaching clothes, or did you see I came across the news how one of the shoe companies got like called out for slicing their shoes so that you couldn't wear them when they toss them. And they're tossing literally thousands from stores and have to slice them before they toss them so people can't wear them. We're creating scarcity as a society and making you pay for it with your labor based on a fictional representation symbol, a fictional symbol that we've created, or a fiction that we have created the symbol of, right?
And it creates a wrench in the gears, because that scarcity has reached a point now where some people simply cannot afford to buy the basic things.
Yeah.
And there are things, and there are houses, there are things. If we would just lower prices, then the wheels would be greased and they would keep turning and we would be fine. But we have no faith in that.
100%.
We just want to. We're hoarders now.
Well, hoarding comes from trauma, though. So
Yeah.
I think that the reason that the narcissistic God Kings were hoarding shit was because they have that traumatic childhood. And in having that traumatic childhood, they were going without food for so often. So now they have to hoard food. We saw this with the 1920s in the Depression, that I've known people throughout my life where they actually like had 3-4 large chest deep freezers full of fucking food because of the fact that, and then their entire house is also stocked, right? Like, because of the fact that they had gone through the Depression, and in that time of starvation, they started having to hoard food as a response. So hoarding is such a trauma response when we look at it, that the reason that we're all buying up as much as we can and taking as much as we can is because we know tomorrow it can leave. And if we know tomorrow it can leave, we have to make sure that we're safe tomorrow, because we are not safe ever, 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 ever. I remember talking to my therapist about the only time I ever felt safe was between my dog and my partner. In bed at night, I would have like 10 minutes where I felt like I was in the safest space, like I was safe. I didn't have to worry. Even if something came to the door, the dog and the partner were big enough and bad enough, I was okay.
It's like these people had never seen Will Smith. And what's that movie where there was a disease and then he was off caught? What was it? You know what I'm talking about?
I think I do, like the vampire movie. Maybe not vampire. No, there's something else.
Well, like zombies or something. Yeah. It's the point is that like if we all found out that the Earth was for real going to go like down, and we were going to have like a lawless society tomorrow, anybody intelligent immediately would start thinking about who their crew's going to be, right? I would not be like, I'm taking off and running into the hills. I would be like, all right, I'm taking off running into the hills. I'm going to take so and so, so and so, and so and so, because they're good at such and such, such and such. Yeah, we would want some supplies, but the most important thing, I think, at the end of the day, for any intelligent human being, higher thinking human being, would be who are we going to take with us? Who's our crew going to be? Because we do need each other.
Yeah. Well, and even today, the idea that we don't need each other is gaslit cognitive disconnect. You have to have people to take care of your children to work. We have to have each other. You have to work for somebody to provide for yourself, and they get nothing if you don't work for them.
Right.
We are so gaslit into this idea that we don't need each other. Well, we are entirely dependent on each other in one of the most locust, flea-like, leeching ways, right? That we
do need each other a lot. Yeah. We would not make it without each other, but like we're so set because we got cars, we got like all this stuff. Think about what happened over in Florida. You hear what happened in Florida with the gas?
No, I've not been watching news.
Okay, so they're preparing for a hurricane, right? Like, and everybody's like, okay, so we're all gonna have to like drive, and everybody's like coming together as a community, and everybody's like, I got this, because I got my vehicle, I'm gonna gas up, and then we're gonna get out of here, me and my little family. Some people are gonna stay, so they got their gas for their generators, things like that. And check this out. Someone contaminated a whole bunch of gas with diesel.
Jesus Christ. I'm not surprised.
So here's the thing. Now they really gotta depend on one another.
Fuck.
Yeah, fuck. Because we're not good at that shit now. We need to be. I mean, it's in our nature to be, but
all that transportation that just ground to a standstill. I mean,
yeah.
And this is after Florida has fucked up and stopped any immigrants from coming across the, into their state, right? Like,
Oh yeah, they're fucked.
yeah, I mean, talk about a way to see late stage capitalism kill you.
Have you tried to buy like oranges or anything, because they don't have the indigenous peoples taking care of the citrus and whatnot, who know how to avoid the, what is it, a fungus or a bug or so? It's a bug that gives a fungus to
No
the
way.
plant
Oh
and
my God.
causes greening, right? Like, so I don't know if you love oranges the way I love oranges. I love oranges. Okay, I love the sweet, sugary, no, 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 the fresh, ripe orange. So, like, here's this particular tree disease leaves them green, so it leaves them sour, nasty, and unripe forever. They're forever unripe until they're rotten. No sweet oranges for you.
Nope. Well, and this is another reason of returning indigenous plant life to indigenous space and making sure it's tended in an indigenous way. I mean, this is the problem with not taking care of things in the manner that they are meant to be cared for. When we get in our head and decide that our ego is dictating how things are supposed to be cared for, how things are supposed to be done, instead of listening to the things themselves on how they are supposed to be cared for and done, we're already dependent on things in a way that we should not be dependent on them. When we mix our ego into it, we start making famine more. Like those lean years can only increase. Where those moments of inability to function on a healthy level for the things that we're trying to interact with, because we're not listening to them, no matter what it is that we're interacting with, we're not listening to, right? When we fail to do that, it kills it off.
See, what had happened was Ug's cousin Thug came along, stole a little bit of fire, right? And that's not such a big deal. That's not such a big. He stole Ug's idea. He stole some fire. He didn't even bother to really learn how to make the fire to begin with. He just like grabbed a stick and ran. He was like, ah! He goes off in his corner. He's got his thing. But then nobody wanted to come to his fire because see, Ug was already established and he was cool. Yeah. So Thug come over. He kicked dirt onto Ug's fire, and then he's charging people to go to the other fire. And they're like, hey, this is kind of a lot. You're doing too much, Thug. And yeah, that's kind of how we got here.
Yeah. I don't think it's Erectus, though. So I don't think it was Ugg and Thug. But I do believe that that's how we got here.
Yeah, just a parody on it.
Yeah, no. I totally got that. I just want to make sure, because you know me, I've got to make sure that the shift.
No, it's like it's in our nature to steal from people, is what I'm saying. Like, as far as like ideas, and then to stand on the shoulders of greatness. But when we don't credit it,
yeah.
Okay, Ugg knew what he was doing with the fire. Ugg knew how to make it. Thug came along. Thug didn't know how to make the fire. Didn't stop to listen to Ugg about how it's made, about how to tend to it. And I mean, Thug could be over there causing like a forest fire. He could be, causing, and then charging people for it, not even tending to it right. Like, listen to indigenous peoples. We know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's okay to share ideas and information. Don't steal without credit.
Well, and I think it's very much a reciprocation within us that, like, I see Ugg as never feeling like no one can have it. It's only when somebody takes it away and is like, it's all mine, right? When somebody isn't sharing, when somebody is keeping for themselves, or, turning it into pay for play, when you're seeing this shift is when Ugg doesn't want to give it anymore, right? Like, it's like, well, shit, you're not using it in the way it was intended to be used, right? Because I think it's way more in our nature to give than it is to take. I think that taking is something that's less natural to us. I think taking comes from I think, again, it comes from dearth. I think, again, it comes from not having enough. And when we get to spaces where part of us don't have enough, or part of us can't have anything, is when we start to see take come in, because I think that reciprocation of give and take of everybody needing it for that communal level, for that nurturing level, right, is way more uh, common within us than the need to take and hoard something is. I don't think that taking and hoarding is common within us until later dates, and I think that it does come from that dearth. It does come from a
Well,
mutation
if you
of
stop
us.
and think, if we're living in a constant state of greed, take, hide, hoard, what does that do to our bodies? Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, our brains are constantly focused on me, my, take, don't care about that person. And here's the thing, like naturally, most of us, someone had said that 1 in 25 people are sociopaths. That's actually not true. 1 to 3% are, but they do exist. That's not healthy. That's not normal. That's not typical. Most of us do have a naturally good feeling when we share. When we share with one another, especially if we give somebody something they really need or they really want, and then that person gets happy. Smiles are contagious for a reason.
yes, yes,
Babies have social smiles, and that is literally a developmental milestone, right? Like, because that's how we're built. It's part of who we are and how we work.
yeah,
But yeah, so like it's not good for our blood pressure, it's not good for our brains, it's not good for our mental health or our physical health to be greedy. I don't know, man.
I agree
We got
100%.
problems.
I agree 100%. I think that I think that um so I do believe that mutation happens, right? And I do believe that I do also believe in epigenetics, right? So I think that trauma gets
Uh-huh.
imprinted on our bones, right? And so I do believe that part of the trauma that gets printed on our bones is the trauma of lack, right? The trauma of starvation, the trauma of lack of safety, the trauma of lack of
Sorry.
safe space, right?
Did I say 1 in 3 people are psychopath? I'm sorry, I just want to correct myself. It's 1 to 3%, so 1 to 3 out of 100. So it's
Yeah.
rare, is what I'm saying. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I was talking about the dark triad earlier when I said I think about 15%, and that's including narcissism and because the dark triad is sociopathy, or psychopathy, narcissism, and God, I always Machiavellianism. There's like three M's, and I'm like, I
Yeah.
always lose the Machiavellianism in my M's. But and that's like 15. But yeah, sociopaths themselves are going to be only a smaller, or not only a smaller percentage, but a smaller percentage of that. So that makes total
Yeah.
sense. But it is still significant, even at 1 to 3%. That's significant in 8 billion people, right? Like there's
Uh-huh.
still so many. I mean, how many in a million? How many in 330 million?
Enough to be problematic, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and enough to. Well, and that's one thing that I had talked about in when I did the treatise year, the paper on the right to life, was the fact that enough of them that they can find each other and create community based on the concept that those thought processes and ideologies are a positive thing, and that means that they're the greatest and they're elite because they possess them, like alpha males, right? Like the thought process that they can possess these narcissistic or sociopathic or problematic, contrary to toxic traits is the best way to put that. Toxic traits, that they can possess those toxic traits and turn those toxic traits into an attainment, something to laud, something to cheer, something to be positive about, right? I have to leave in like 6 minutes, so everybody knows, because I need to get out of here and get ready to go.
We need to get you out and about more. I didn't realize that you were going agoraphobic on us.
I've been going agoraphobic for the last couple of years. I'm really working on it. I go out every day. It's just, well, not every day. I go out less than like, I don't like going out. I can't go out. I went out
Yeah.
alone to the grocery store a couple of weeks ago and I did our grocery shopping on my own. I'm actually starting to be more comfortable like cooking again. But which is a whole nother subject. But I was kind of I try to get out and I do things. It's just not comfortable or safe, and I have to make sure that I have certain groups or people around for me to be able to do them, right? And I know
Mm-hmm.
it's heading towards agoraphobia. That's why I'm working on it. I know it. I'm like, oh, fuck, Sarah, you can't do that.
Well, anybody is susceptible to that. Just like, depression can be like whenever I have a friend who loses a family member, right? Like, and I'm checking on them. One of the first bits of advice I give them is maintain your schedule. Like, write down what you did yesterday in the order, okay? And for like the last week, write down your schedule. Maintain just those hours, if anything. Push through it because, like, you don't want to cause your body. We can cause our bodies to break down and become clinically depressed when we're going through stressful events in life and things, and I gotta say, I didn't like what I saw during the pandemic either.
Yeah.
Being in Kansas during the pandemic was very scary because initially there were all those preppers that were like, I got a mask and it's a super spiffy, and they were running around with that. And then as soon as yeah, I don't want to talk about politics on your channel, but the point is that as soon as they realized that the rest of their political party wasn't for it, they
Switched it.
Well, it's not so much that they wouldn't wear masks; it's that they would chase other people who were wearing masks around and cough on them.
Oh, good goddess. What a. And that's what just blew my mind about the whole thing. The whole time was, it's not about whether or not you get sick. It's about whether or not you're getting other people sick. You don't know if you're sick. That's why you got to wear a mask, because you could kill somebody. Do you want to be the author of somebody else's death? How is that sitting with you? And there were people like, that's just ridiculous, going around and purposely trying to be the author of somebody else's death, right?
Yeah, and for me, it's, I don't know, like, I work with people and I have for many years, so I actually genuinely like people, right? I don't want to hurt anybody. So, like, if somebody tells me, and I've maintained for years my tetanus shot, right? And the reason I maintain my tetanus shot is because I work with people, and in that tetanus shot is a pertussis shot. People bring their babies when they go to buy things. And I don't want to, catch pertussis and not show any symptoms, and then, give somebody's baby pertussis who's a whooping cough. It's really serious. I don't know, man. It just that brought out an ugly side to humanity that I did not realize was so bad. I never in a million years thought that we would have anyone in our society that would be like that. It's very strange to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it is strange to me. And it's strange to me how it just quickly became deified as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like
very
this
strange.
Run towards it. I don't get, and specifically the group. Specifically because there is this gaslight that their deity wants them to treat everybody in a wonderful way so that they can get to a wonderful space. You must do good works so that you can get to good place, right? And not that I'm saying that it follows that, right? And not that I'm saying, like, we've gone over what I think of the way that they teach that, right? Still, specifically a group of people who can speak daily about how that's what you're supposed to be doing, right? And then flip it into, how dare you do that? I'm going to do the exact opposite, and how dare you do that? Well, I preach it, like the hypocriticism and the gaslight of the hypocriticism. And it's so weird to me.
Yeah. Some of them would yell at me, like, take that off. Why? Why are you yelling at me to take my mask off? It's weird.
Yeah.
It's affecting my freedom, my rights. it, but I'm being serious though. I'm not just making
No, I
fun of them. That's literally
know.
what they did.
The fact that it
And
can come to
it's,
that disconnect. That's what it is
well,
that makes me
there's,
laugh.
you want to talk about confusion and how messed up. There was a lady who, I actually liked her. She was a decent person. She made the choice not to get vaccinated because her husband wasn't getting vaccinated because he's tough enough, right? And he's not going to be controlled by no government. So she chose not to get vaccinated, and then she ended up becoming ill, getting COVID, and then she lost her leg from a blood clot from COVID. And yeah, that was, and to this day, as I understand it, she believes that because people who were vaccinated around her got vaccinated, that's what caused her blood clot, she thinks. And I don't.
Were you sharing blood with
There's
them? Were you swapping needles?
no.
Like, I mean, how do you explain that? Like, that's that to me is the like I do my best to understand how people come to conclusions. Like, I try and put myself in other people's shoes a lot, right? Like, especially like knowing so many different cultures and stuff and people within. I try and listen and put myself into reasoning and understand. There are some things that in my head I'm like, everything points to exactly opposite of that. So how the hell did you reach that? Right? Like,
yeah, and I mean, again, your body is a beautiful, miraculous thing with millions of years of evolution behind it. Okay, but don't forget your brain is part of that. And Ugg is a pretty smart dude. Okay, we put him in the damn lab coat for a reason. He's got all this paper behind him. He knows what the hell he's doing. He got good grades in school. We have collectively decided that Ugg knows what the hell he's doing.
yeah.
I don't know. Critical
Well, and
thinking.
we have, and Ugg could be brilliant, and Ugg can be completely right about fire. But if we ignore the fact that, over there is a little less brilliant, and Click, in their less brilliance, still was able to spear down an animal, right, and figure out a new form of spear, right? If we ignore that they were able to do that off of Ugg's work too, because they needed the fire to figure out the new form of spear, and in ignoring that, we make Ugg the only hero in the story, right? And Ugg has the need for everybody to worship him as he gets later in life, right? Like, Ugg has the need for everybody to come and get fire from him, right? And so we have ignored all the beautiful things that came from Ugg's thought process, or not thought process, but intelligence. And we only laud Ugg's thought processes and later life actions, and we don't laud, Clicks as well. When we refuse to see all the different depths that goes within and the value of each person's contributions to those different depths, and that those contributions are equal whether or not they're brilliant or not, right? When we start stratifying that, when we start, exploiting that, that's.
So I was watching a show about early hominids on YouTube, and it was talking about how they secured the hand axes and the arrowheads basically to the tips of spears at one point. And they had to heat up, it was either animal fat, beeswax, or like tree sap, right? And they had made like a glue, and then a notch into it. But this was, the fire was necessary, right, for this purpose. However, their particular